It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Introducing the definitive Project Apollo iceberg. I say definitive because, to my understanding, it's the only Project Apollo iceberg. I built this myself with a lot of help from Space Twitter, a comprehensive list of things everybody should know about the only spaceflight project to ever send human beings beyond low Earth orbit. I'm just going to go ahead and assume I'll have this video finished before the launch of Artemis 2, and I think that's probably a safe bet. First, the crash course. If you somehow don't know, Project Apollo was a NASA program that landed 6 crewed missions on the surface of the moon between 1969 and 1972. However, there is so much more that went into Project Apollo than the basic events that everybody knows about. So today, we're going to talk about all of the things that most people don't know about Apollo in descending order of obscurity of the information. This is going to be a wild ride. The shuttle program almost looks like a well-oiled machine compared to the wild cowboy days of Apollo.
48 seconds, throttling down for Mexico.
Roger, ignore the master alarm, Columbia.
Coming up on...
Building this iceberg was a complicated and stressful process because, as it turns out, once you dive down deep enough, you realize it's not so much an iceberg as it is a barely explored vast Apollo ocean. Before we go into it, I need to thank some people. The following should be a complete list of the people who helped build this iceberg, with the exception of one person because she has an entire tier name dedicated to her. Here we go. Thank you, Sovereign of Kent, Kev Conrad, RD270, Rare North American Space Koala, Nerdium, Benjamin Gosh, Astro Avada, Leaf Doe, Sea Dragon Nerd, Conspiracy Slayer, Pixel, Gazuka1, Scott Manley, Saturn Shuttle, Perigee Aerospace, Tristan Moody, by Grabthar's Hammer, Xander Evans, Renbird, Rusa, Frederick Drew, Chris Chatfield, Hendrik Stoops, Jake Adkins, Lamenta 3, Matt Cribbs, Space Fox, Saturn 1B, Caleb Bingham, Phoebe Plague, All Things Space 33, Booster 9, Jay Space Stuff, Joe B, Spacey McSpace, Hub, V-Wolf, Leet Dan, Gary Bleck, Lincoln the Nerd, Remington, Barak Alparslan Kaya, Cauldronlim Opus, Glenny, I Can Not Spell, Competitive Spy Crab, Pamba, Clay Suds, Phantasmacality, Spamule, JM, GmbH Fowler Shocken, Oliver Ridge, Dieter McPherson, Space Timer, Ultra Sheeplord, Bree, Bob 8 Sameo, Echo, Lahiro Udara, Jay the Amazing, Spoober, Mark, 3D Artist Truthful, OV101, Val's Aerospace, Gentleman's Aeronautics, a massive thank you to Everyday Astronaut, and I think that's everyone. I'm very sorry if I forgot anyone. Oh, and while she didn't directly contribute to the iceberg itself, I'm also going to thank Sherry, because I can. Thank you, Sherry. Alright, that's that. Now let's get on with it. The Project Apollo iceberg. Here we go. Apollo 11, the one successful mission from the entire program that everyone remembers and knows because it was the first crewed landing on the surface of the moon. Everyone remembers that on this flight, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first human beings to set foot on the moon. They'll likely remember the planting of the flag, maybe the reading of the plaque, and a few of the words spoken.
Underneath it says, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. It came in peace for all mankind."
However, there is so much more to the flight of Apollo 11 that we'll dig into further in the lower tiers. For now, we have what the public knows. Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong lands on the moon. They probably don't even remember Buzz Aldrin, sadly enough. Moving forward. Apollo 13. The other mission from the Apollo program that more or less everybody remembers, largely thanks to the directorial work of one Ron Howard. The 1995 film somewhat dramatizes the events of NASA's greatest failed success, but it gets most of the technical details right. Because of this, most people will remember that Apollo 13 suffered a critical failure on its way to the moon, was losing power and oxygen, and the crew was in serious danger of dying. However, through perseverance and ingenuity, the crew managed to return home alive and well. There's a lot more to it than that, but going into it would require another video unto itself, which I made. It's right here in the top right corner. However, I'll go through the basics. The failure was caused by an explosion within an oxygen tank, which is also used for electricity. The explosion occurred when stirring fans inside the tank were activated, and damage to the fans during production caused a spark. The explosion blew off an entire panel of the spacecraft, and the crew worked with mission control to carefully isolate the power systems and board the lunar lander as an emergency lifeboat. They then performed correction burns to return home, which had to be done with the lander's engine rather than the service module, forcing them to rewrite the math of the burns on the fly. They also had to fix a problem with the carbon dioxide scrubber, needing to combine pieces of the scrubbers for the lander and the command module, and quite literally fit a square peg into a round hole. Through all of this hardship, the crew, Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert, were able to get back home safely, and the mission is often remembered as NASA's finest hour. When everything went wrong, they stayed calm, found solutions, and executed them perfectly. One small step for man. The legendary first words as spoken by Armstrong as he descended the ladder of the lander and set foot on the moon. It is one of the most widely redistributed pieces of audio in existence. We've all heard it 1,000 times. We know the intonation, the way he pauses between one and giant leap, and it's a legendary moment, but there's a little more to it than the public remembers. We'll come back to these momentous words a little bit later.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The space race. I think most people are aware of this time in history existing, the entire reason for the Apollo program to happen in the first place. Beginning with the launch of the world's first satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957, the United States and the Soviet Union went head-to-head in a technological arms race, desperately trying to one-up each other in first-time space achievements. The Soviets gained an early lead by putting the first animal, man, and woman into orbit, those being Laika, Yuri Gagarin, and Valentina Tereshkova, respectively. The United States trailed behind during Project Mercury, but quickly gained ground with Project Gemini and began making their own firsts, such as the first orbital rendezvous and docking. By the time President Kennedy made his iconic "We choose to go to the moon" speech, the final goal of the space race was established when the Soviets scrambled to bring their own crewed lunar programs into operation. Project Apollo led the final lap of the race, crossing the finish line when Apollo 11 touched down on the moon's Sea of Tranquility in 1969. Shortly afterwards, Nikolai Kamenin, head of the Soviet Cosmonaut Office, would write in his journal that, quote, "We have lost our superiority in space." And I'll also take a quick opportunity to plug another extensive video I did about the truth of the first achievements of the space race. Top right corner. Conspiracies. I absolutely hate that I had to put this on the top tier, but unfortunately it's true. Most people are aware of the claims that the Apollo moon landings were a hoax. Why? Who cares? It's among the dumbest conspiracies out there in my opinion because, as you'll see during this video, so very much work went into Project Apollo that it would have been completely impossible to fake. All you need to do is do a little bit of research beyond what the general public knows about it, hint hint, and you'll see how much evidence there is, and how much evidence for a hoax there isn't. Every single claim made by an Apollo hoaxer can be swiftly debunked in a matter of seconds. I spent a number of years doing it on this very channel, so let me quickly put my debunker hat back on and go through a few of the more common points. They say the flag is waving in the wind, usually referring to the ripple in the fabric caused by a stuck telescopic rod at the top, because believe it or not, you can't actually see motion in a photo. But does it wave?
It won't go up.
Another argument is that there was no delay in Nixon's famous phone call to the astronauts. But was there no delay?
The President of the United States is in his office now and would like to say a few words to you, over. That would be an honor.
And one in our prayers that you will return safely to Earth.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's a great honor and privilege for us to be here.
It really is that easy. We'll probably come back to this here and there, but for now, I'm just going to say, man landed on the moon, it really happened, it wasn't faked, I was there, I was the moon. Cope. Seethe even. Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon. You know him, you love him. There's a lot to say about Neil, enough that Ryan Gosling played him in a major motion picture based on his life, which we'll come back to, but we'll go through just a few things here. Neil was NASA's first civilian astronaut, as at that time, all of NASA's crews were made of military veteran test pilots. Not that Neil didn't serve in the military, he was a lieutenant in the Navy and flew during the Korean War. However, by the time he was a test pilot for the X-15 project, which actually predates NASA, he had been out of the military for too long to qualify for NASA's first astronaut group. He instead joined the second group in 1962 and flew as commander of Gemini 8 in 1966, performing the first docking of 2 spacecraft in orbit. He would then go on to be the commander of Apollo 11 and, alongside Buzz Aldrin, became the first person to land on the moon. He resigned from NASA in 1971 and taught aerospace engineering at the University of Cincinnati until 1979. He did, however, serve on the Apollo 13 Accident Investigation Board and the Rogers Commission following the Challenger disaster in 1986. Armstrong passed away in 2012 after complications from a surgery at the age of 82. There's so very much to say about Neil that can't be contained in just this video. He was a very private man, very unassuming and down-to-earth, and quite frankly, the perfect person to command Apollo 11. I think everything that can be said about Neil is contained in this photo here from 1978. It contains 17 of the 24 Apollo astronauts who went to the moon. There's Buzz Aldrin front and center. That's his personality. He's happy to be in the limelight and be the life of the show. But where's Neil? He's way back here. That's what Neil was like. He was just a guy who happened to have a very extraordinary life. The Blue Marble photo. The general public may not know this photo by name, but I guarantee they've seen it before. Practically everyone has seen it before. This is the Blue Marble, the original Blue Marble. There have been several images given that designation, and some are of less than ideal quality. With the end of Apollo, nobody was out in deep space far enough to photograph the entire Earth, so for a brief period in the 90s and early 2000s, the only way to image Earth was with a series of stitched-together images from low-orbiting satellites, which would later require some touching up to make them look halfway decent. Nowadays, we do have satellites high enough to image the entire Earth, such as the Discover satellite and the Himawari 8. Arguably, we now have new Blue Marble images being taken every 10 minutes or so. But nothing compares to the original, the photo taken on December 7, 1972, from a distance of about 29,000 kilometers by the crew of Apollo 17 while it made the program's final trip to the moon. While the Apollo astronauts took many full images of the Earth, and some of them are very spectacular, let's be honest, this one is the most well known due to the fact that almost a full disk of the Earth is visible, and the rarely seen Antarctica is almost completely visible at the bottom, or rather the top of the image. You see, the version we see is usually both cropped and rotated 180 degrees. When the photo was taken, Antarctica was at the top of the image. I actually prefer the original photo. The fact that Earth isn't in the center and it's upside down from what we're used to drives home the fact that a human being took this photo, holding a 70mm Hasselblad camera with an 80mm Zeiss lens. He took this photo, brought it to the moon, and then back to Earth, and then it was processed in a darkroom, and now we can see it. How incredible is that? You may be asking, precisely who took the photo? Well, the crew of Apollo 17 consisted of Gene Cernan, Ronald Evans, and Harrison Schmitt. So, which one of them took it? The answer is yes. In later interviews, the crew appeared to have conspired together, and when individually asked if they took the photo, all 3 crew members said that they did. There is evidence to suggest that one has been singled out now, but I'm just not going to tell you that part. I'd like to leave it the way they wanted. The crew took the photo. The crew that went to the moon for the last time. None of them did anything on their own. The Lunar Rover. I'm not going to say too much about the Apollo LRV or Lunar Roving Vehicle just yet, because all the general public knows is that it exists. They had a lunar rover. This is true, though the rover wasn't introduced until the final 3 missions. It was used primarily to allow the astronauts to get a little distance away from the lander with some speed, enabling sample retrieval from a wide radius around the landing site. It was also just cool. You can tell by watching the footage that the astronauts think they're the coolest guys riding in that thing. Because they are. So there we have what the general public, sadly, knows about the Apollo program. They remember 1 out of 6 landings, a rover from a different landing, a movie, and some words and names. There is so much more to this monumental and momentous program than what there seems to be on the surface. Let's take a little scratch at that surface, down at Tier 2. The mighty Saturn V. God, what can I even say? Just watch and listen to this for a moment, would you? Prepare your ears. This is loud. That is the Saturn V, the rocket that took humans to the moon. It's the larger brother of the Saturn 1B, which we'll come back to, and boasts a monstrous 7.6 million pounds of thrust at launch. It was, until very recently, the single most powerful rocket ever made, and remains an impressive feat of engineering that cannot be exactly repeated today. Not to say we can't build such a powerful rocket anymore, we can and we have, but we will never build that powerful rocket anymore. It was truly one of a kind. Many probably recognize this iconic black and white Titan, and some might even remember the dramatization of its launch process from the Apollo 13 film. However, in my opinion, the real thing is so much more impressive. The first stage, or S1C, utilized 5 Rocketdyne F1 engines that burned a kerosene-rich fuel mixture, with the outer 4 capable of gimbaling for control and the center engine fixed. The S1C was responsible for carrying the rocket for the first 61 kilometers, being jettisoned in a very dramatic-looking staging process just under 3 minutes into the flight. The next stage, the S2, utilized 5 Rocketdyne J2 engines in a similar arrangement to the first stage. This stage would carry the rocket most of the way to orbit, cutting off and separating around 9 minutes into the launch. The third stage, or S4B, would use a single J2 engine to put the spacecraft into a parking orbit, and then later would demonstrate a feature that was unique to rockets at that time, relighting itself a second time to perform a translunar injection burn, putting the spacecraft on a path to the moon. The Saturn V flew a total of 13 times, with 12 missions being dedicated to Apollo flights, and one flight, its final flight, being dedicated to the launch of America's first space station, Skylab. All 13 flights were largely successful, with some partial failures here and there, which I'll get into. I could almost make an entire video about just this rocket, but instead we'll come back to some of the quirks and interesting facts about it in later tiers. For now, we can just marvel at the monster that took human beings further than they've ever gone before. I mentioned earlier that there were in fact 6 crewed landings on the moon during Project Apollo, and that the general public really only remembers one of them. However, Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17 all landed and all performed spacewalks of varying natures with varying crews. You'll get to know hopefully all of these astronauts somewhat through this video, but we must not forget about all the missions that also preceded Apollo 11. One does not simply launch a rocket to the moon and land there all in one go. Oh no. There were several pre-landing missions, beginning with 10 uncrewed test flights of components of the Saturn I rocket, then 3 test flights of the Saturn 1B, somewhere in there were 7 abort system tests, and then, finally, the Apollo flights actually begin. Apollo 4 and 6 would launch uncrewed flights of the Command and Service Module, certifying them to later fly with crew. Apollo 4 was also the first test flight of the Saturn V. Apollo 5 would use a Saturn 1B to do an uncrewed test of the lunar module, certifying it for crew use as well. Apollo 7 began manned flights, using a Saturn 1B to send a crew into orbit aboard the CSM and evaluate its performance. Apollo 8 sent the first humans into orbit of the moon, spending 20 hours there before returning. This was also the first crewed flight of the Saturn V. Apollo 9 again used the Saturn V to send the first CSM and LM combo into Earth orbit, the crew using them to demonstrate the rendezvous and docking methods that would be used on later flights. Finally, Apollo 10 performed a full dress rehearsal of a lunar landing. They launched and burned to the moon, the lander disconnected, descended to 15 kilometers above the lunar surface, then engaged its ascent stage and returned to the CSM. All of this work, these many flights and tests, some of which were not entirely successful, went into putting a man on the moon. Never for a moment think that what the Apollo program achieved was easy to do. Apollo-Soyuz, the first international handshake in space. The first crewed space mission between two nations occurred in July of 1975, when a United States Apollo spacecraft docked with a Soviet Soyuz spacecraft. It served as a symbol for the relaxation of strains between the two nations during the Cold War. It involved 5 people. Flying for the United States was Thomas Stafford, Vance Brand, and Deke Slayton, who was the only Mercury astronaut who never had a chance to fly in that particular program. For the Soviets, Valery Kubasov and Alexei Leonov, the latter of whom had performed the world's first spacewalk a decade earlier on Voskhod 2. They performed a number of experiments together while in orbit, including an arranged eclipse of the sun using the Apollo spacecraft to block it, allowing the Soyuz instruments to take photographs of the solar corona. Despite all of the friendliness, Apollo-Soyuz also came with its fair share of criticisms from both sides from an engineering standpoint. Soviet spacecraft were designed with automation in mind, minimizing the risk of human error. In contrast, the US spacecraft were designed specifically to be operated by highly skilled crews, and instead tried to reduce the risk through the use of redundant components. Christopher C. Kraft, director at Johnson Space Center, specifically criticized Soyuz for its lack of redundancy, stating, quote, "We in NASA rely on redundant components. If an instrument fails during flight, our crews switch to another in an attempt to continue the mission. Each Soyuz component, however, is designed for a specific function. If one fails, the cosmonauts land as soon as possible." The Apollo-Soyuz Test Project, or ASTP as it was known, was also notable for being an exception to the USSR's common practice of keeping the details of their space program secret from the world at large, especially Americans, resulting in an unprecedented sharing of information between both sides before and during the flight. Perhaps the thing I find most interesting about this mission is the docking adapter. Generally speaking, spacecraft use a passive and active set of adapters. One part is designed to fit into the other and lock together. However, both Apollo and Soyuz have the active adapter, designed to be maneuvered into a passive adapter. In addition, the two spacecraft are pressurized differently. The Apollo spacecraft used pure oxygen at 5 psi, while the Soyuz used oxygen and nitrogen at 15 psi. So, the two spacecraft had to use a special docking module and airlock designed specifically for this mission. Carried behind the Apollo spacecraft at launch, this module had to be retrieved from the upper stage of the Saturn 1B after reaching orbit, docking with the same probe and drogue mechanism NASA commonly used on one end. On the other end, it had an adapter designed to fit with the Soviet androgynous peripheral attachment system. You see, it's called androgynous because another way to say active and passive is to say male and female. You know, tab A fits into slot B. So the APAS was used because neither country wanted to be the female end. Sexism. The lunar rover deployment. After seeing the lunar rover, especially when it's sitting next to the lander, you may ask yourself, how'd they get that thing there? It certainly doesn't look like it would just fit on the side of the lander, and of course it wouldn't. They got it there by folding it. They used a system of pulleys and ropes to first pull down half of the chassis, which would automatically fold out the rear wheels. Once those wheels were on the ground, pulling the rover would unfold the front of it and deploy the front wheels, and the astronaut then used a pulley to slowly lower the entire vehicle to the ground. And there you have it, one lunar roving vehicle neatly packed in the side of the descent stage, no assembly required. Well, a little bit of assembly required. Remember that the next time a conspiracy theorist asks you how the rover got there. Earthrise. Another one of the more famous Apollo photographs, Earthrise is often confused for a picture of Earth as seen from the surface of the moon. Going back to conspiracy theorists, that's why they'll ask how Nixon could possibly have this photo in his office while he's speaking to the Apollo 11 astronauts. However, the photo was actually taken from lunar orbit on Apollo 8 by astronaut William Anders in 1968. When he first saw it, Anders was photographing the lunar surface in black and white and remarked on the beauty of the Earth rising above the horizon. Anders was quickly handed a roll of color film for another photo by astronaut Jim Lovell, resulting in the photo that we're more familiar with, the Earth having rose above the surface of the moon further by that point in the spacecraft's orbit. I'd put Earthrise second behind the blue marble as one of the most widely redistributed photos of all time.
Oh my God, look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, that's pretty. Hey, don't take that, it's not scheduled. You got a color film, Jim? Hand me a roll of color quick.
Oh man, that's great. Where is it?
Quick.
Hey, I got it right here.
Let me get up this left clear.
Oh, I got it right. Oh, that's a beautiful shot.
The Eagle was low on fuel. The general public is not aware that Apollo 11's landing on the moon was a much closer call than it seems. On the surface, without knowing what all of those different callouts over the radio mean, it looks quite smooth. However, take a quick listen to this.
Okay, 75 feet. That's looking good, down a half.
Touch.
6 forward.
60 seconds.
60 seconds. Lights on. 6. Down 2.5. Forward. Forward. That's 40 feet, down 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward, drifting to the right a little.
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay. Contact light.
You hear them repeating those numbers, first 60 seconds, then 30 seconds? What they're referring to is the remaining burn time on the descent engine. When they said 30 seconds, they mean the LEM is going to run out of fuel in around 30 seconds. As they approached their landing site, which was being determined by the LEM's flight computer, Neil Armstrong took a look out the window. He saw that the target area was a field covered in boulders, so he took control and found a clear patch of ground, heading towards it. As they got closer, he saw his new chosen site had a crater in it, so he had to move again to find level ground. Around this time, the engine started kicking up dust from the lunar surface, obscuring Armstrong's view. Around 100 feet above the lunar surface, Armstrong saw some large rocks jutting up from the cloud, and he used them as a reference point to determine their speed and location. By the time the long contact probes at the feet of the lander were touching the surface, the LEM had around 15 seconds of fuel remaining. However, they touched down, shut off the engine, checked their instruments, and informed Mission Control that they had landed.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Okay, everybody, TU1. Stand by, TU1.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
The dwindling fuel had made the atmosphere at home very tense, and this is why Charlie Duke at Mission Control said, "We're breathing again." Apollo 11 made it by the skin of its teeth. Michael Collins, the often forgotten third crew member of Apollo 11. Each flight to the moon had 3 crew members: a commander, Neil Armstrong, a lunar module pilot, Buzz Aldrin, and a command module pilot, Michael Collins. The first 2 of these crew members would take the LEM down to the moon, and the command module pilot would remain in lunar orbit to dock with the LEM's ascent stage after the landing. It is often argued that Collins, as well as the other command module pilots, had the loneliest job, remaining in the CM all by themselves hundreds of thousands of kilometers away from the Earth. Moreover, when Collins was on the far side of the moon, he would be unable to contact Mission Control or Neil and Buzz, further escalating the isolation factor. Collins is often spoke of as the loneliest man alive at the time of his mission, and he detailed his experiences in a book called Carrying the Fire: An Astronaut's Journey, which is a must-read for anyone with an interest in the Apollo program. Now we return to Neil Armstrong's historic first words on the moon, and what they were actually supposed to be. You see, the way Neil said it doesn't exactly make sense. Man and mankind are synonymous, so he was effectively saying, that's one small step for mankind, one giant leap for mankind. There's a simple reason for his error. He was supposed to say one small step for a man. For years, both NASA and Armstrong insisted that he did in fact say a man, but static over the radio had obscured the recording. Armstrong stated he would never make such a mistake, but after repeatedly listening to the various recordings, he would eventually admit that he must have simply omitted the word by accident. And I mean, you can't exactly blame him. Adrenaline is probably running pretty high when you're about to set foot on the moon. In more recent years, several different people have performed digital analysis of the audio and concluded that Armstrong did say a man, but the A was inaudible due to the limitations of the technology at the time. You see, the radio didn't have a mic switch to turn the microphone on or off. It was a Vox or voice-operated key, designed to pick up sounds over a certain threshold. It may have simply decided that the A wasn't loudly spoken enough to broadcast. In reality, we'll likely never know if it was actually said or not. The CSM-LM spacecraft. This is one of those things that people know about the pieces of, but usually don't know how it all worked together. The CSM, or Command and Service Module, was located at the top of the Saturn V rocket just below the abort tower, which would be used to carry the command module away in the case of a launch emergency. After reaching orbit, the abort tower would be gone, as would the first 2 stages of the Saturn V. The third stage, the S4B, would relight itself and put the craft on a trajectory toward the moon. And at this point, assembly of the CSM-LM began. A fairing on top of the S4B would open up like flower petals, releasing the CSM, which would float forward. Below it was the lunar module nested on top of the S4B. The astronauts would then use the thrusters on the CSM to kill their relative velocity, spin around until they're facing the LM's docking port at the top of it, and then move in and connect with it. After docking, the LM would be separated from the S4B, and the spacecraft would emerge fully assembled. After reaching the moon, the LM would be powered up, extend its landing legs, and undock from the CSM with 2 astronauts aboard. They would use the LM's descent engine to land on the moon, and after they had done their work, the ascent stage of the LM would disconnect from the lower portion using a second engine to go back up into lunar orbit and dock again with the CSM. The astronauts would transfer themselves and everything else into the CSM, and then before re-entering Earth's atmosphere, both the LM and service module would separate from the command module, which would be the only portion to return to Earth and land. Now, the exact details of this entire process would vary from mission to mission, and we'll come back to probably all of those variations, but for now, this crash course on how to go to the moon should suffice. The fate of the American flags. Again, this varies from mission to mission, but the truth is, by now, all of the Apollo flags have turned white, and at least one of them was knocked over completely. Them turning white seems to be fairly well known, as it's one of those fun did you know facts that have been spread around by memes and news articles over the years. On the moon, there is no atmosphere to protect it from the sun's radiation. Even on Earth, a flag left out in direct sunlight for many years will inevitably fade until being nearly unrecognizable, so consider the moon flags that have been taking the full force of the sun's radiation for the last 50 plus years. By now, every single one of them would simply be a white flag suspended from a telescopic metal pole. When the aliens arrive, they'll assume we've surrendered the moon 6 times. What's more, after Apollo 11 returned, Buzz Aldrin stated that he saw the blast of the ascent engine knock over the flag they had planted, so that one is also laying on the ground in addition to being bleached white. As a result of this, NASA told later moonwalkers to plant the flags a little further away from the lander, but judging from this footage of Apollo 14's lunar liftoff, I'm not sure that they listened.
4, 3, 2, 1. What a liftoff. And liftoff. Roger, ignition.
Lunar golf. I wanted to put this on the general public tier, but people insisted otherwise. I thought everyone knew about the iconic image of an astronaut smacking a golf ball on the moon and watching it sail off into the sunset. This occurred on Apollo 14, the third lunar landing, with astronaut Alan Shepard, who was also the first American in space on Mercury Redstone 3 in 1961. Shepard had brought along a Wilson 6-iron golf club head, which he attached to the handle of a backup sampling tool, and 2 golf balls. He took 2 one-handed swings, stating that the second ball went for, quote, miles and miles.
Miles and miles and miles.
Later, astronaut Edgar Mitchell used a lunar scoop handle and threw it as if it were a javelin, and both items, scoop and ball, were found in a crater some 40 and 24 yards away, respectively. Hammer and feather. Another thing I thought was common knowledge, and it should be, as it's apparently taught in American textbooks. However, I was informed that many have likely forgotten one of the Apollo program's most famous physics experiments. On Apollo 15, David Scott used a falcon feather and a hammer to demonstrate Galileo's theory that all objects in a vacuum should fall at the same rate, regardless of weight.
Falcon, and I'll drop the 2 of them here, and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that? It proves that Mr. Galileo was correct in his findings.
The competing Soviet lunar program. Many people are aware of the space race, that the United States and the Soviet Union were going head-to-head with progressively more advanced space technology and techniques culminating in landing man on the moon, but most of my viewers are more likely only aware of the Western side of that race. They know about the Saturn V and the Apollo spacecraft, and maybe they know about the Gemini program and what it did to pave the way for Apollo. But what were the Soviets doing? Well, their lunar program began with the Soyuz program, the spacecraft still used by Roscosmos today, though slightly updated over the years. Soyuz had a shaky start when Soyuz 1 failed during landing, resulting in the first official Soviet spaceflight death, Vladimir Komarov. In their early years, chief engineer Sergei Korolev began designing the Soyuz ABC circumlunar complex, which involved assembly of a lunar vehicle in low Earth orbit launched there by R-7 rockets. Korolev incorporated the N-1, a super heavy lift launch vehicle he had proposed much earlier, planning a landing mission using 2 launches and docking. Later, he managed to increase the payload of the N-1 enough to perform a lunar landing in a single mission, which would compete with the American Apollo program and its Saturn V. However, the Soviet lunar program suffered greatly when Sergei Korolev passed away in 1966, and the government was pushing for a crewed landing by the end of 1968. Development of the extremely complex N-1 and its 30-engine first stage resulted in 4 failures, 2 of which occurred after Apollo 11 had landed on the moon. While technically never fully abandoned, the Soviet lunar program was pushed permanently to the back burner and remained there for the rest of time. Apollo 1. The Soyuz program may have had a shaky start, but the Apollo program had an equally shaky start in the same year. At the time, Apollo 1 had been called AS-204, which was scheduled to be the first crewed flight of the program. The crew was Ed White, Roger B. Chaffee, and Mercury and Gemini veteran Virgil Gus Grissom. The original mission plan detailed a launch into low Earth orbit aboard a Saturn 1B and testing of the functionality of the Apollo command module, certifying it for more flights. However, none of this would come to pass as AS-204 ended prematurely on the launch pad during a routine test. On the 27th of January, 1967, the crew were performing what is known as a plugs-out test. This means that the spacecraft was disconnected from all cables and umbilicals and operating under its own power, rather than using the power of the ground support systems. This particular spacecraft was one that the astronauts did not like. They had voiced a lot of concerns about its design, and engineers were struggling to keep up with the proposed changes. Apollo was a bigger and more complex spacecraft than they'd ever designed before, and challenges were abound. Primary concerns revolved around the amount of flammable material inside the cabin, which was a problem due to the pure oxygen environment that circulated inside. Furthermore, the hatch of the spacecraft was designed to be opened inwards, which the astronauts saw as awkward and difficult to maneuver around. Little did they know, these two problems would compound on each other when a fire started inside the cabin. A surge in power had caused one of the flammable wires to create a spark, and in the oxygen-rich environment, the fire spread quickly. The astronauts tried to open the hatch and get out, but found that they couldn't. In the pressurized cabin, the fire had actually increased the already high pressure, making it virtually impossible to open the hatch. All 3 astronauts tragically perished, and the entire Apollo program was placed on hold. It would be some time before NASA had buckled down and made their spacecraft safe and ready before man would continue on his path to the moon. Tier 2 complete. Reminder that we are still on top of the iceberg. We're still above the water. From here, it's impossible to see just how deep down everything goes. The Saturn I and the Saturn 1B, the often forgotten little brothers of the mighty Saturn V. Despite being physically smaller, the Saturn I and 1B came before the Saturn V, with the Saturn I actually being the United States' first medium-lift launch vehicle that began development before NASA was even founded. Its first stage was built around a cluster of fuel tanks from other, older vehicles. You may notice the United States text along these tanks here and how similar they look to the tank of the Mercury Redstone rocket, because that's exactly what they are. The Saturn I was used as a kind of groundwork for testing later needed Apollo concepts such as upper stage engine restart required to make an accurate translunar injection burn. After witnessing a Saturn I launch, President Kennedy stated that this would be the rocket to bring US dominance to space over the Soviets, as until this point, US rocket tech had been somewhat lagging behind.
And last Saturday at Cape Canaveral, I saw our new Saturn C1 rocket booster, which with its payload, when it rises in December of this year, will be, for the first time, the largest booster in the world, carrying into space the largest payload that any country in the world has ever sent into space. That's what I consider.
Once the Apollo program began to enter operational status, the Saturn 1B was brought in to replace the Saturn I. Not only did it uprate first stage performance, but its upper stage, the S4B, was the same stage that would later become the third stage of the Saturn V, providing a common interface between the two rockets. The two actually used the same launch tower, but because the Saturn 1B was significantly shorter than the Saturn V, it was given a stool to sit on, which will never not look funny to me. The Saturn 1B would be used for early test flights required to certify the Apollo spacecrafts in low Earth orbit, capable of lofting either a half-fueled CSM or a fully fueled LM into orbit. It launched a total of 7 times for Apollo flights, 3 times for Skylab, and then once for the final time for the Apollo-Soyuz test project. Cancelled missions. It would likely surprise some people to know that the Apollo program, despite being the unquestionable success that it was, ended prematurely. There were more missions on the table that were supposed to take place after Apollo 17, but never did. Even before that, a number of Apollo missions were cancelled or completely rearranged after the Apollo 1 fire. Originally intending to fly the first test flights on the Saturn I, this all had to be rescheduled for flights with the Saturn 1B, as the Saturn I wouldn't be capable of lofting the Block 2 CSMs into orbit. As for the later cancelled flights, they occurred much earlier in the program than one might expect. After Apollo 12, Apollo 20 was cancelled to instead make way for the launch of Skylab using the Saturn V. Following the failure and near loss of Apollo 13, Apollo 18 and 19 were also cancelled, and for a brief time, President Richard Nixon was asking to cancel everything after Apollo 14. While he was persuaded not to do this, NASA astronauts were also lobbying to schedule a landing on the far side of the moon. However, in the end, the program would end with Apollo 17, which landed back on Earth on December 19, 1972. Pogo oscillations. God, that's a fun phrase to say. Pogo oscillations. What are pogo oscillations? Pogo oscillations are the result of an unstable combustion cycle with rocket engines, causing thrust to rapidly increase and decrease, which in turn causes the entire rocket to quite literally bounce along its longitudinal axis. This is a problem because, traveling at the speeds they do, pogo oscillations have the pesky side effect of basically shaking the rocket to pieces. They cause extra stress on the vehicle's flexible structure and can damage the fuel tanks and staging mechanisms. So, what exactly causes this unstable combustion? Well, it's a little complicated. Basically, due to the non-uniform nature of the thrust of the engine, sometimes you'll get a surge in chamber pressure. This causes back pressure against the fuel coming into the engine. This in turn reduces the amount of fuel flowing in because there's already so much of it backed up, and this also reduces chamber pressure. Then the cycle repeats. More pressure surges in, creates back pressure, reduces fuel flow, and reduces chamber pressure, only for more to surge in again. Pogo oscillation was a problem NASA first experienced with the Titan rocket, delaying their ability to make it a human-rated launch vehicle, and it again became a problem for the Saturn V. The F1 engines on the first stage were extremely ambitious, given that nothing so large and powerful had ever been attempted before. The second flight of the Saturn V, Apollo 6, experienced extreme pogo oscillations in the first two stages. The first stage performed relatively well despite increased G-forces on the payload, but the second stage lost the use of two engines, and the third stage failed to restart on orbit. As a result of these partial failures, serious redesign elements were added to the F1 engine, but not all of them were implemented. Apollo was executed on something of a time crunch, and adding all of the various fixes to the many existing engines would delay the program further. Worse, pogo was an inconsistent problem. Some flights wouldn't have it happen at all, and some would. As a result, it became difficult to diagnose the problem, further slowing the implementation of fixes. Apollo 8 had a fix put in place to prevent pogo on the first stage, but the problem again appeared on the second stage. Apollo 9 attempted to fix this, but failed, resulting in more minor oscillations. Further fixes were delayed, causing them to not be implemented at all on Apollo 13, which had issues that caused an early center engine shutdown of the second stage. After 1970, the problem had been more or less fully eliminated, but existed as a lingering concern for the remainder of the Saturn V's operational life. Jack Swiggert's taxes. I thought this, and honestly anything mentioned in the Apollo 13 movie, should be up on higher tiers, but here we are. Jack Swigert was a late addition to the crew of Apollo 13. The original lineup had Ken Mattingly in his place, but Mattingly was grounded due to possible exposure to rubella, or German measles. Mattingly never did get sick, but Swigert flew in his place anyway before that could be confirmed. As a result of being a late addition, Swigert had gotten a little excited in preparation for the mission, and in a brief moment of levity following Apollo 13's tank explosion, he informed Mission Control that he had forgotten to file his tax return for that year, which would be due on the day that the spacecraft would make its closest approach to the moon, April 15th.
Today's favorite pastime across the U. Have you guys completed your income tax?
How do I apply for the extension?
Yeah, Joe, I gotta. Hey, that ain't too funny. Things kind of happen real fast down there, and I do need an extension.
The Mission Control Room was busy laughing when he told them that he was serious and needed to ask for an extension. At this point, Flight Director Glyn Lunny told him that Americans who are out of the country on the due date are entitled to a 60-day extension, and that he, quote, assumed that this would apply. Lunar takeoff filming attempts. Most people have seen this footage before of an Apollo ascent module blasting off from the moon, the camera panning up as it rises. It's often confused for footage from Apollo 11, but it's not. It's actually from Apollo 17, and is the footage of the last two humans to leave the moon in 1972. Often when this footage is seen, it is met with incredulity as to who filmed it, so when that question next arises, you'll be able to respond with as detailed an answer as possible. Prior to Apollo 15, the only method for filming lunar takeoff was from inside the lunar module, such as this footage here from Apollo 11, or the one we saw earlier from Apollo 14. Apollo 15 introduced the lunar rover, which also introduced a second method to transmit information via its antenna, and a place to mount a camera pointed at the lander. In fact, all three of the remaining missions filmed the lunar takeoff from the lander, with the camera's motion being controlled from Houston. However, the reason you usually only see the takeoff of Apollo 17 is because the first two attempts don't exactly provide the best views. For Apollo 15, the camera wasn't controlled at all, remaining focused on the descent stage as the ascent stage blasts off and out of frame. For Apollo 16, the camera was controlled, but pitched up too late and too slowly to catch a good view of it from much further than the liftoff. Part of the reason this is difficult to do is due to the distance between the Earth and the Moon. Radio signals travel at the speed of light, meaning the controller of the camera had to anticipate the planned events and remain ahead of them by around 1.3 seconds. No easy task. However, for Apollo 17, they finally nailed it, perfectly pitching upwards to show the ascent stage of the last lunar lander rise up and out of the range of the camera's movement limits.
Ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector good. Excellent.
N1 number 2. We spoke earlier about the massive N1 and its many problems, though briefly. Its 4 test flights varied greatly in performance and accomplishments, with its final flight almost reaching first stage separation. However, its second failure was such a spectacular one that it is something of note, being among the largest, if not the largest, rocket explosion in all of history. July 3rd, 1969. N1 serial number L5 sits on the pad at Site 10 in Baikonur, Kazakhstan. It carried a Zond spacecraft, which we'll cover more later, but was one of a few different options that the Soviets proposed for their lunar program. One engineer claims it also carried a mass simulator for a lunar lander, but this is unconfirmed. At 23:18 Moscow time, N1L5 lifted off the pad, rose just above the launch tower, and then a flash of light turned the bottom of the rocket into an explosive firestorm, with all engines shutting down except for one. The remaining firing engine caused the rocket to tilt as it fell, almost completely filled with fuel, back onto the launch pad. A massive blast and shockwave from the impact shattered windows across the entire launch complex and sent debris flying as far as 6 miles or 10 kilometers away from the pad. Shockingly enough, this was a far better outcome than what could have been. The worst case scenario would have been if the ruptured liquid oxygen and fuel tanks had mixed to form an explosive gel, but this fortunately didn't happen. A post-flight investigation revealed that, as a matter of fact, around 85% of the rocket's propellant didn't even detonate. A half hour after the explosion, preliminary investigations began, and workers found unburned droplets of fuel still raining from the sky. However, despite the largely intact fuels, Launch Complex 110 East had been almost completely leveled by the blast. The concrete pad caved in from the impact, and a lightning pole found knocked over and wrapped around itself. The cleanup took some time. As a matter of fact, 110 was still being repaired when Apollo 11 lifted off from Florida and put an end to the space race. The cause of the failure was traced back to a turbopump in the number 8 engine, which exploded, the blast causing cascading failures across the rest of the lower first stage. The launch escape system had activated and performed nominally when the failure began, and while theories were put forth, the exact cause of the number 8 engine failure was never determined, nor was the reason for the number 18 engine remaining firing until the impact. The Apollo 11 circuit breaker incident, otherwise known as the day a pen saved the first moon landing. After their historic moonwalk, Aldrin and Armstrong were preparing to return to the CSM and begin the journey home. Buzz glanced at the floor and, by his feet, noticed some loose dust collected there. From his book, Magnificent Desolation, The Long Journey Home from the Moon, Aldrin wrote that, quote, "I looked closer and jolted a bit. There on the dust on the floor on the right side of the cabin lay a circuit breaker switch that had broken off."
So I laid down on the floor with my head to the right, which is the co-pilot side, and I'm looking around in the dust that came in, and there's this little black object. This was a circuit breaker that was broken.
Huh? Oh, yeah.
Buzz looked at the row of circuit breakers on the LM's control panel. He saw which one was missing and swallowed a lump in his throat. Quote, "The broken switch had snapped off from the engine arm circuit breaker, the one vital breaker needed to send electrical power to the ascent engine that would lift Neil and me off of the moon," he wrote. It was determined that the switch must have been bumped by their large, cumbersome backpacks when they got back into the lander. Regardless of how it happened, they knew that without that switch being pushed back in, the ascent engine of the LM was not going to ignite. They would be stranded. They reported the issue to Mission Control, and then had to try and get some sleep before they launched the next morning. By the time they awoke, there was still no solution. Mission Control didn't know what to do. Buzz took a closer look, deciding that there must be something on the LM he could use to push into the circuit. Because it was electrical, he didn't want to use anything metal, or his own finger, but he did have a felt-tip pen in his pocket. He pushed the pen into where the circuit breaker switch was supposed to be, and sure enough, it held.
So I look, what can I use? I look at my little finger and there's electricity behind there. I'm not sure that that's going to work. But I had gotten a felt tip pen so I could read the writings on the rendezvous charts. So I used the felt tip pen 2 hours before. Hey, we got circuit, we got power.
The circuit was completed, and the ascent engine would work as planned. To this day, Buzz still has both the broken switch and the felt tip pen in his possession. Now we come to the most difficult part of this iceberg. Calling it a touchy subject would be the understatement of the century. Now we must discuss the uncomfortable reality of Operation Paperclip and Werner von Braun. Strap in, everyone. This is going to be a long and bumpy ride. At the end of the Second World War, the usual thing that happens after a war began to happen. To the victors go the spoils. Both the United States and the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent the United Kingdom, began to snatch up what was left of the top mines from Nazi Germany, as well as any leftover Wehrmacht equipment. For the Soviets, this effort was called Operation Osawehim and involved rounding up around 2,500 Nazi scientists, engineers, technicians, and even whole families almost entirely overnight. Many would be put to work in the Soviet ICBM program, which would eventually result in the Soviet space program growing out of the world's first ICBM, the R-7. For the Americans, this effort was called Operation Paperclip. In late April of 1945, the Allied forces were advancing into Nazi territory, and often, many would surrender. In particular, Nazi scientists and other specialists were taken in and interrogated, and the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff quickly realized they had a major opportunity on their hands, as these people had technical knowledge that could be put to great use in the post-war world. They established a secret recruitment program, initially called Operation Overcast, in July of 1945. Once the Allies had reached Peenemünde, Overcast had become Paperclip, named after the paperclip that would be placed on the folder of German rocket scientists that the United States wanted to employ. They had formed a list called the Iceberg list, consisting of Nazi scientists and specialists that the Joint Chiefs of Staff Special Division had, quote, politically cleared for reassignment and work in the United States. At the very top of this list was Germany's greatest rocket scientist, Werner von Braun. Von Braun was born in 1912 in a small town that is now part of Poland. He pursued rocket engineering from a young age, being a fan of Opel Rack, the first rocket company in the world, founded by Fritz von Opel and Max Valier in 1928. The 16-year-old Werner was so enthusiastic about Opel's public demonstrations of rocket-powered cars and planes that he constructed his own homemade rocket car, attaching fireworks to a wagon and nearly injuring himself and others when he set it off on a crowded street. He continued an interest in rockets and spaceflight throughout his early life, obtaining a diploma in mechanical engineering before going on to obtain a doctorate in physics in 1934. When the Third Reich began clamping down its hands on Germany, von Braun was already working as the technical director for the Army Rocket Research Center at Peenemünde. In 1937, von Braun officially joined the Nazi Party, writing that his work had begun attracting attention from high places, and he believed that refusing to join the party would result in him needing to abandon his life's work. He continued to work for the Nazis in the aggregate rocket program, designing and building several models of rocket to be used, most notably the A-4. Uses for the aggregate rockets were varied, including interesting tests of aerodynamics that would be key to von Braun's later plans. However, the success of the A-4 overshadowed much of the other plans. It would be better remembered as the V-2 and began being mass-produced and fired at England over vast distances. The V-2 was built almost exclusively with slave labor, something von Braun was well aware of, and it would actually end up claiming the lives of more laborers than it did by being fired at targets, with those numbers being around 12,000 and 9,000 respectively. Von Braun admitted to visiting the V-2 factories at Mittelwerk, seeing the working conditions and referring to them as repulsive, but felt helpless to do anything about the situation. Von Braun was briefly imprisoned by the Nazis in 1944 after he had made dissatisfied comments regarding his work in the war. He was eventually released after a few weeks due to the fear that the V-2 program and its proposed successor would be impossible without von Braun's leadership. Early the next year, however, everything would change for Werner von Braun. When the Soviet army was advancing on the Peenemünde Research Center, von Braun assembled his staff and discussed their options. Not wanting to surrender to the Soviets, they instead chose to surrender to the Americans, but would actually end up retreating further into Germany to continue their work. However, near the end of the war, Hitler had ordered for all German rocket scientists to be gassed, and von Braun would flee with the rest of his men to the advancing American lines in Austria. When they arrived, his brother Magnus approached an American soldier and said, "My name is Magnus von Braun. My brother invented the V-2. We want to surrender." Von Braun began hesitant work with the United States Army at Fort Bliss outside El Paso, Texas in 1946. At first, he was able to accomplish very little, all of his requests being rejected, and he was hypercritical of the United States' slow pace of development. He worked with Project Hermes to refurbish old Wehrmacht V-2s and investigate the possibility of their use as space rockets. Later, now in Huntsville, Alabama, von Braun was assigned to the team responsible for the Redstone rocket, and his work with it led to the first U.S. satellite, Explorer 1, being launched on a Redstone-derived Juno 1 rocket. As he had in Germany, von Braun continued to propose options for human spaceflight and orbital rocket development, writing of lofty goals such as rotating space stations built with reusable rockets and working out concepts for crewed missions to Mars. Around this time, he also became a very devout Christian, after attending regular church in El Paso. He stated that it was a way to, quote, pacify his own conscience, and was moved by a, quote, desire to find a new direction for his life after the moral chaos of his service for the Third Reich.
I believe there are two forces which move us. One is belief in the last judgment, when every one of us has to account for what he did with God's great gift of life on the earth.
In 1958, NASA was established. Work on the Redstone missile was transferred to development of the Mercury Redstone rocket for use in NASA's first crewed space program, with von Braun at the helm of engineering the launch vehicles. He became the first director of the Marshall Space Flight Center and worked on the Apollo project with the design of his greatest accomplishment, the mighty Saturn V that put humans on the moon, a goal he had spent his entire life waiting for the opportunity to achieve. Von Braun would then move to NASA headquarters and serve as Deputy Associate Administrator for Planning. Again frustrated with the budget cuts and impending cancellation of Apollo, von Braun retired from NASA in 1972 with the feeling that his true lofty goals for spaceflight were completely incompatible with NASA. The next year, he was diagnosed with kidney cancer, and while he continued to work for space and engineering companies for several years, his health deteriorated and he retired in 1976 and then passed away in 1977 at age 65. The full story of Wernher von Braun, his ethics, his true goals, and his role in the world of spaceflight is a very long and complicated one. It may warrant a video unto itself one day, but today, I just wanted to give you the basic story of how a former Nazi rocket scientist came to be pivotal to the world of American spaceflight, a fact that aerospace enthusiasts everywhere have to grapple with every day. Hasselblad cameras. A Swedish manufacturer of medium format cameras, photography equipment, and image scanners, this company had enjoyed only a mild amount of success until 1962, when NASA Mercury astronaut Wally Schirra carried a Hasselblad 500C with an 8mm lens on his Sigma 7 flight. Impressed with the results, NASA made an official partnership with the company for future flights, utilizing them extensively across Project Gemini and into Project Apollo. Film cameras are capable of extremely high amounts of resolution, capable of being upscaled absurdly high without any loss of quality. The use of these Hasselblad cameras are the reason we have such remarkable images of the Apollo missions today. Cameras that were actually left on the moon after removing the film. Weight restrictions, you know. The Apollo 12 lightning strikes. One of my personal favorite stories. Apollo 12, the second crewed landing, lifted off on schedule on November 14, 1969, in less than ideal weather conditions. The overcast and rainy skies were creating harsh wind conditions, and as the vehicle climbed into the clouds, the unthinkable happened. At 36 seconds into ascent, the Saturn V was struck by lightning.
30 seconds. Looks good. Roll, start late. Move. 200 feet. The hell was that? I lost a whole bunch of stuff. I don't know. Some buses. Mark 1 Bravo. Roger. We had a whole bunch of buses drop off. That's nothing. It's nothing. I think it's... What we got? I can't see. There's nothing wrong. AC bus 1 light. All the fuel cells.
Given that nobody really saw it happen at the time, complete confusion ensued. A flash of light and a loud crack in the clouds, and all of a sudden the astronauts were looking at a control board completely covered in red lights. All 3 of the CSM's fuel cells had been knocked offline by the static discharge of the lightning strike, though the crew didn't know the reason at the time. Power had switched purely to the spacecraft batteries, and because this wasn't a sufficient amount of power, even more red lights were appearing. Then, at 52 seconds into the flight, the realm of unthinkable was wholly passed when the rocket was struck by lightning for a second time. The 8-ball navigation indicator was knocked offline. Over the radio were loud, invasive bursts of static that drowned out everything else. The telemetry data became completely garbled. Nobody, not the astronauts or mission control, knew that the Saturn V was continuing to fly true, running on the instrument guidance unit that functioned independently from the CSM.
Okay, we just lost the platform, gang. I don't know what happened here. We had everything in the world drop out. There's nothing I can tell is wrong, Pete. I got 3 fuel cell lights, an AC bus light, a fuel cell disconnect, AC bus overload, 1 and 2, main bus A and B out.
John Aaron came to the rescue. Aaron's role for the launch was Electrical, Environmental, and Consumables Manager, or ECOM. During an earlier test, a similar telemetry failure pattern had occurred, caused by a power loss to the Signal Conditioning Electronics, or SCE. Remembering this, Aaron made a call.
Houston, try SCE to auxiliary, over. Try SCE to auxiliary. What the hell is that? SCE to auxiliary.
The switch he referred to was so obscure that neither the flight director, Capcom, or 2 of the 3 astronauts even knew where it was. Lunar Module pilot Alan Bean, however, did know, and quickly flipped the switch that would move the SCE to an auxiliary power unit, which brought the telemetry back online. After resetting a few more things and then carefully checking out the spacecraft in its parking orbit, the mission continued as normal when the S-4B reignited to perform the lunar injection burn. I will add, though, that there was a concern that the lightning strikes might have damaged the compartment of the command module that contained its parachutes. However, the decision was made to not tell this to the crew, since there was absolutely nothing that could be done if the parachutes were to fail. Nevertheless, despite being struck by lightning twice, Apollo 12 was a complete success, landing safely with all 3 parachutes intact. Apollo Bibles. The first book to ever land on the moon was the King James Bible. Prior to his death in the Apollo 1 fire, Ed White had expressed in an interview that he had hoped to be able to carry a Bible to the moon. After the fire, the other Apollo astronauts were determined to honor his wish, but it took a few tries to do it properly. Alan Bean attempted to bring the Bible to the moon, but due to a mix-up, the Bible only orbited the moon. I'm struggling to find details about the mix-up, but I'm guessing the Bibles were supposed to be transferred to the lunar module, however they got mixed up with a different bag or something and only ended up orbiting the moon aboard the CSM. Apollo 13 made the second attempt, but we already know Apollo 13 didn't get the chance to land on the moon. Apollo 14 would be the first to successfully land the Bible on the moon, and David Scott of Apollo 15 would bring even more, leaving one on the dashboard of the lunar rover. Nowadays, the lunar Bibles are sold at auctions for collectors at quite the cost, despite the fact that there are hundreds of them. Now, one might be wondering, how do you bring hundreds of Bibles to the moon? Spaceflight revolves largely around reducing weight. The crafts are made out of strong but light aircraft-grade aluminum, every pound is accounted for, and the Bible is a big, heavy book. Well, the answer to this is simple. The lunar Bibles were printed in microfiche. The text is so small that it can only be read with a microscope, making them less functional Bibles and more of a novelty. They exist so that you can hold up a piece of metal the size of a pin and say, "This was on the moon." Contact light. Now we come to the real first words spoken on the moon. Usually, all people remember is Neil's first words when he stepped onto the moon, but sometimes people will hear the audio of what was said as the LM landed, and more often than not, a large section of this is cut out. You'll hear Buzz say, "Contact light," and then you'll hear Neil say, "Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed." However, what's cut out is several amusing seconds of technobabble that few have heard before and even less understand. Here's the full audio.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. APA at a descent. Mode control both auto, descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. Port 13 is in.
We've had shutdown.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Okay, everybody, T1, stand by for T1.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
So let's take a moment and break down exactly what Buzz was saying here. Contact light we've covered. The gold contact probes on the feet of the lander had encountered the lunar surface, sending a signal back to the LEM to let the astronauts know they were almost down. Engine stop is fairly self-explanatory. A button was pressed that would immediately set the throttle of the descent engine to 0. ACA out of detent is a little more complicated. ACA was the attitude control assembly, the control stick. Out of detent means that the ACA was in attitude hold mode, meaning that unless the pilot tried to orient the ship, the control thrusters would attempt to hold the last commanded orientation. In short, this would stop the thrusters from firing on the surface. Mode control both auto refers to the guidance system. Having switched it from automatic to manual when the automatically selected landing site was no good, it was now switched back to automatic in case the LM needed to do an emergency ascent. Both refers to the primary guidance and the abort guidance, which had separate mode controls. Descent engine command override off means that the autopilot can no longer override control of the descent engine. Engine arm off means that the descent engine was fully shut down. 413 refers to an address of the abort guidance system that contained the variable that the LM had landed. A lot of steps to accomplish simply to properly land on the surface of the moon. Surveyor 3. The Surveyor program was an uncrewed precursor to the Apollo landings, with the primary goal of demonstrating that soft landings on the moon were in fact possible. The Soviets were doing this too. Their analogous program is called Luna, and Luna 9 was in fact the first craft to soft land on the lunar surface in history. The Surveyor program sent 7 probes to the moon. 2 failed, and 5 landed safely. All 7 remain on the moon to this day, except for some pieces of Surveyor 3, which remains the only spacecraft on another world to be visited by humans, the crew of Apollo 12. Intending to prove the LM's ability to perform precision landings, Apollo 12 touched down within walking distance of Surveyor 3. Astronauts Pete Conrad and Alan Bean examined the spacecraft and removed 10 pounds of equipment from it for a return to Earth, including its TV camera and its soil sample scoop. There was something of a controversy surrounding the Surveyor 3 probe when it was discovered that a very small amount of bacteria was on it, leading NASA to spend many years adopting new strict policies and procedures for preventing the contamination of the solar system with Earth-based bacteria, which are famously resilient to the universe's harsher conditions. However, independent investigators have posited that the contamination actually occurred during transportation to the clean room well after Apollo 12's return to Earth. The Walk of Fame. This is one of those things conspiracy theorists love to point at. The Apollo 11 astronauts were given a special star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Now, why exactly would astronauts be given a Hollywood award unless this is a subtle clue that the landings were a Hollywood production? And why would such a clue be left at all? Shut up. Don't ask follow-up questions. Anyway, in the early 1970s, the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce made the decision to make the Apollo 11 star, or rather 4 of them, each located on the 4 sidewalk corners at the intersections of Hollywood and Vine. They consist of circular moon-like plaques of silver and gray terrazzo, rimmed in brass, set in a pink square terrazzo in the same style as the other stars. The circular plaques contain the mission name, the date, and the names of the astronauts. So, why is it there? Well, it's very simple. The mission was broadcast on television. One reporter referred to it as the single most important television broadcast in human history. Conspiracy theorists tend to forget that documentaries of real events still count as TV. Apollo 10's fuel. This is something that has been dramatized and speculated about many times over the years. If you recall, Apollo 10 was effectively a wet dress rehearsal for the first lunar landing, taking the LM all the way to 15 kilometers above the lunar surface before jettisoning it and using the ascent stage to return to the CSM. There's frequently a claim that Apollo 10's LM didn't have enough fuel to perform a landing. In fact, some even claim that there was not enough fuel on purpose, just in case the astronauts decided to go rogue and perform a landing anyway since they were so close. However, this isn't exactly true. In fact, the Apollo 10 LM descent stage had a few more pounds of fuel than the Apollo 11 descent stage did. But at the same time, the Apollo 10 LEM was heavier than the Apollo 11 LEM because Grumman had not yet made the final changes to the design that it would do for Apollo 11. As a result, all fuel calculations were made to make the missions relatively the same, since the entire point was to test the landing formula. The A-10 ascent stage was also given less fuel than it needed to ascend directly from the surface, instead of having enough fuel to ascend from the predetermined altitude. While the astronauts may have occasionally joked about landing early, they never would have and never could have done it. While they have their cowboy moments, Apollo astronauts were mostly consummate professionals. Skylab, NASA's first space station. This subject could be, and in fact it will be, a long-form documentary unto itself. However, today we're just going to do the crash course version of Skylab's history. Launched devoid of crew in 1973 aboard the final Saturn V rocket, Skylab was a single piece that was, itself, built out of a Saturn V third stage or S4B. It saw 3 separate crews over 24 weeks between May 1973 and February 1974, delivered to the station via a modified Apollo CSM and Saturn 1B rocket. Skylab contained a multispectral solar observatory, a docking adapter, an airlock module with hatches for EVAs, and its main area, the orbital workshop. Over the course of its lifetime, hundreds of experiments were performed aboard Skylab, significantly advancing solar science with the Apollo telescope mount and set new records for long-duration stays in space. Originally intending to reuse Skylab by boosting its orbit, development of the spacecraft to do so, the Space Shuttle, was delayed while Skylab's orbit gradually decayed. Skylab re-entered Earth's atmosphere on July 11, 1979, amid worldwide media attention as it wasn't entirely sure where it was going to come down. NASA had attempted to adjust its orbit prior to re-entry to minimize risk, and while partially successful, large portions of debris fell over Western Australia, where the largest remaining pieces are displayed in museums to this day. The Genesis readings and lunar communion. Perhaps better remembered in certain communities, like, religious communities, are the two significant moments of Christianity to occur during the Apollo program. In part 1, we discussed the microfiche lunar Bibles, but did you also know that Apollo 8 did a reading from Genesis while orbiting the moon? Almost all of the Apollo astronauts were very public about their devout faith, and the Apollo 8 crew decided to symbolically take the religion further than it had ever gone before by transmitting this audio to Earth on Christmas Eve, 1968.
The crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. Let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day. God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Then with Apollo 11, Christianity took yet another step into the cosmos when Buzz Aldrin was on the moon the next year. However, by this time, NASA had received an amount of pushback from the public due to the Genesis readings on Apollo 8. People felt uncomfortable by it, believing it to be somewhat in conflict with the First Amendment, which relates to government influence in regards to religion and religious expression. In fact, the organization American Atheists went so far as to sue the United States government for a violation of the First Amendment, though the case was dismissed. As a result of the tension of the subject, Buzz was very quiet about the fact that he took Holy Communion while on the surface of the moon. In the downtime period between landing and stepping out of the LEM, while the two were preparing for a moment they knew would go down in history, Buzz Aldrin was casually and quietly producing a small amount of wine and a chalice given to him by his local church. He poured the wine, noting the way the liquid curled slowly around the rim of the cup in the moon's low gravity. He quietly read some scripture, drank the wine, and ate a communion wafer, while Armstrong watched but did not participate. They then continued to prepare for their historic moonwalk without the public having known that anything had happened, though some news outlets had reported that Aldrin planned to bring communion bread to the moon. Apollo 12's broken TV camera. If you saw the previous video, and I hope you did, you might have noticed that there wasn't much footage from Apollo 12's moonwalk. Lots from 11, 14, 15, 16, and 17, but not 12. There's lots to say about the launch, and lots of photos, especially involving the Surveyor spacecraft, but not a lot of video. That's because they broke the TV camera. Apollo 12 was the first landing mission to use a color camera, a portable RCA TV camera. Alan Bean, after stepping onto the lunar surface and retrieving it from his mount on the lander, carried the camera to a spot where he could set it up for a wider shot. However, as he did so, he accidentally pointed the lens of the camera straight at the sun, which immediately burned out and destroyed the secondary electron conduction tube. The feed was lost completely, and as a result, television coverage of the mission quickly ceased.
Camera off.
Al, we have a pretty bright image on that TV. Could you either move it or stop it down?
Okay, I'm going to have to stop it down. That's as far as it goes, Houston. How does that look to you?
No, it still is the same, Al. Why don't you try shifting the scene?
Apollo 12 continued as planned, performing several interesting experiments and retrieving pieces of the Surveyor 3 probe. However, unlike the other missions, nobody saw any of it until they got home and developed the film photographs. The curious case of the Apollo 11 seating arrangement. Generally speaking, at launch, all Apollo missions had specific spots for each crew member to sit in. The command module pilot was in the center, the lunar module pilot on the right, and the commander on the left. However, for Apollo 11, lunar module pilot Buzz Aldrin sat center, command module pilot Collins sat on the right, and Commander Armstrong on the left. So why the change? Well, it's sort of a long story. Michael Collins had been, at one point, command module pilot for the prime crew of Apollo 8. However, in July of 1968, Collins suffered a cervical disc herniation which required surgery to fix. As a result, he was replaced on the crew of Apollo 8 by Jim Lovell. Once Collins was back in shape, he was actually something of a late addition to the crew of Apollo 11, and at the time, Buzz Aldrin had been trained for the center seat, being backup CMP for Apollo 8. So Collins simply learned what he needed to know to fly the right-hand seat for launch, while Buzz stayed in the position that he already knew best. Not that it would matter much past launch, because everybody pretty much sat where they wanted to at that point. Alright, let me just try and say this with a straight face. The Apollo 10 floating turd. Oh boy. Let's set the scene. Apollo 10, crewed by Commander Tom Stafford, Command Module Pilot John Young, and Lunar Module Pilot Eugene Cernan, is in lunar orbit. The crew is making preparations to burn away from the moon and begin the return journey home. When suddenly, well, let's just read the transcript. "Oh, who did it?" asks Stafford. "Who did what?" Young asks. "What?" Cernan also asks. "Who did it?" Stafford repeats, laughing. "Where did that come from?" Cernan asks, as they spy the mysterious floating feces aboard their spacecraft. None of the crew members believed they were responsible for it as they continued to dodge the turd and find something to grab it with and stow it in a trash bag. On more than one occasion, Stafford insisted that it wasn't his because his was, quote, stickier than that, and Cernan points out that it didn't match the consistency he had noticed when he stuck his finger into his own. Yeah, they get into some really gross details as they try to figure out who did the deed, and the best part? They never did reach a conclusion. Someone had failed to seal the bag that was attached to their buttocks in their suit, and a piece had gotten out. Whose? How did they mess that up? Honestly, who knows? If you already saw the shuttle Iceberg, you'll know that poop in space is an unsettlingly common subject. Strolling on the moon. A little palate cleanser after the previous, sticky subject. The Fountain in the Park, otherwise known as While Strolling Through the Park One Day, is a pretty well-known song first published in 1884 by vaudeville actor Ed Haley. It's one of those songs everybody knows and has heard at some point or another, despite it not being that heavily featured in popular culture. Perhaps its most famous rendition was performed on Apollo 17, while Harrison Schmitt and Gene Cernan were walking on the moon toward a large patch of rocks. Let's listen.
I was strolling on the moon one day in a merry, merry month of December. Now, May, when much to my surprise, a pair of bunny eyes. Do-do-do-do-do. Oh, is this a neat way to travel? Isn't it great? Dum-da-dum-dum-dum. Dum-da-dum-dum-dum.
Nixon's other speeches. Boy, the tone of this video is a bit of a swinging pendulum, huh? President Nixon had prepared a speech written by one Bill Safire to be read in the event that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were stranded on the moon and unable to return to Earth. It's pretty intense, stating that, quote, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace," referring to their deaths as heroic sacrifices that brought humanity together and would continue to do so. It closes with, quote, "For every human being who looks up at the moon in the nights to come will know that there is some corner of another world that is forever mankind." At the bottom of the so-named Sapphire memo, it states that Nixon should call the widows of the astronauts prior to making the speech. Below that, it also states that at the point NASA ceases communications with the astronauts, a clergyman should be present and operate as though a burial at sea were occurring, commending their souls to the deepest of the deep, and concluding with the Lord's Prayer. Thankfully, of course, this speech never had to be read. Now, here's the thing. At the time I made this Iceberg, I wrote speeches, plural. However, there were only 2 speeches prepared, and one is the speech that did happen when the mission was successful. However, my mama didn't raise no liars, so here's a satirical speech I found while searching. The astronauts have exploded. Hold for applause. The J missions. A lot of people don't realize that each Apollo landing mission had different goals based on the landing site and the equipment they had on them, as well as their progress through the program. A and B missions were unmanned test flights of spacecraft, C and D missions verified the CSM's capabilities and tested the lander, E missions never occurred, but record states that they would have been, quote, manned flight of the complete lunar landing mission vehicle in Earth orbit to great distances from Earth, effectively meaning flying everything almost to the moon and back. Apollo 8 effectively made this unnecessary by taking a CSM to lunar orbit with crew, so it was never flown. The F mission was Apollo 10, a dress rehearsal of lunar landing, and then G was Apollo 11, the first lunar landing. From there, H missions, Apollo 12, 13, and 14, were meant to demonstrate the LEM's ability to perform precision landings, and while Apollo 13 wasn't able to do that, Apollo 12 did it perfectly by landing within walking distance of the Surveyor 3 probe. Finally, the last class of mission, J missions, would perform proper scientific investigations over longer durations. Apollo 15 spent over 19 hours doing spacewalks on the lunar surface, compared to Apollo 11's 2.5-hour stay. By the end of the program, Apollo 17 was able to stay for 22 hours, and all 3 J missions would do extensive amounts of geology work on the moon's surface. The rovers used on these missions allowed for better and faster sample retrieval, and his television camera allowed geologists at home to participate in the crew's surveying work. The 3 canceled missions, Apollo 18, 19, and 20, would have also been J-type missions. The LLRV, and similarly the LLTV, perhaps the wackiest machines that NASA has ever flown in their entire history. Nicknamed the Flying Bedstead, the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle was made by Bell Aerosystems in an effort to build a working simulator for the Apollo landings in real-world environments, and first flew in 1964. It's a pretty simple craft, with a wire frame, 4 landing legs, a seat for a pilot, and a singular General Electric turbofan mounted on a gimbal. Because it was expected that every lunar landing mission would require manual control on final descent, it was important that the pilots get a feel for what that would be like. To simulate that, the engine would lift the vehicle up to a test altitude and then throttle back to support 5/6 of the vehicle's weight, which would simulate the low gravity conditions of a descent on the moon. The pilot would use a set of 18 hydrogen peroxide thrusters to control their descent, allowing full control of pitch, yaw, and roll. The LLRV and later the improved lunar landing training vehicle were finicky and dangerous beasts at best. Of the 5 built, only 2 remain, as they had a tendency to, crash. Here's Neil Armstrong ejecting out of LLRV-1 at 200 feet in May of 1968 after a control problem. He was unharmed, but the vehicle was obviously lost, an event that grounded remaining flights until the improved LLTVs could be shipped to Ellington Air Force Base. The LLTV similarly crashed when test pilot Joe Algranti lost control in December of 1968. A flight readiness board was formed that included Mercury astronaut Deke Slayton, mission operations veteran Chris Kraft, and Maxime Fazet, who was responsible for the design of the Mercury spacecraft and was serving as director of engineering at Johnson. After reviewing wind tunnel results and making some changes to the enclosure around the pilot, the LLTV was cleared for resumption of test flights in March of 1969, all 18 of which would be successful, allowing for its use by every single lunar module pilot in the Apollo program at some point or another. Armstrong would later write that his training in the LLRV was key to the success of Apollo 11's landing, and that if he had never flown in it, he could never have made the landing. Oh, the third one to crash happened in 1971 when testing a major modification to its computer system. The pilot, Stuart Present, was unharmed. Capricorn 1. Here's our first mention of conspiracies about Apollo in this part of the iceberg. Capricorn 1 is a 1977 thriller film about a reporter uncovering a conspiracy involving the faking of a crewed mission to Mars. The film itself is pretty unremarkable, most critics found it lacking much style or substance, and it barely broke even upon release. What is more significant than the film itself is the role it plays in conspiracy theories. You see, the makers of Capricorn 1 decided that the best spacecraft to land on the planet Mars was the Apollo lunar lander. Like, they didn't change it at all, it's just a straight up mock-up of the LEM. Because, of course, if you're going to land on Mars, a planet with an atmosphere and around 0.38 Gs of gravity, you'd use the LEM, a vehicle specifically designed to fly in a vacuum, to a body with 0.16 Gs of gravity. So because of this very Hollywood decision, sort of like a movie where the space shuttle travels beyond low Earth orbit, you end up with footage of an Apollo LEM in a film studio. While the area surrounding it is colored to look like the surface of Mars, a bit of Photoshop work fixes that up pretty easily, especially since monochrome photos were very common in the Apollo era. Stills and short pieces of footage of Capricorn 1 have been picked up over time by Apollo hoaxers and often displayed online as behind-the-scenes footage of Apollo. A common instance of this claim is this post which claims that WikiLeaks has released the footage of the Apollo hoax. Of course, there is no such WikiLeaks page that makes this claim, and the footage is in fact a mashup of footage from Capricorn 1, footage from Apollo training, and actual Apollo moonwalk footage, with faked production audio over top of it. Use of Capricorn 1 for Apollo hoaxers is so common, in fact, that Bart Sibrel used it as the cover art for his film, in big quotes, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. Remember that name, Bart Sibrel. We'll come back to him. Oh, and one of the astronauts was played by O.J. Simpson. I feel like whenever I see his name in pop culture pre-1995, it feels like it's been deep-faked in there.
We don't want you in our town, Simpson. We don't love you like we did in 1993. Go!
Missing tapes. Keeping with the theme of conspiracies, this is a pretty big one. You might often see claims that use a lot of words interchangeably stating that NASA lost all the moon landing footage or lost all of the Apollo data. But as usual, the truth is far more complicated and far less interesting than that. Did NASA lose something related to Apollo? Yep, they sure did. What exactly did they lose? Okay, take a seat. On Apollo 11, several reels of telemetry data tapes recorded the slow scan telecast or SSTV in its raw format during the broadcast. These data tapes were used to record the data for backup purposes. In order to even make the broadcast of the SSTV footage, NASA ground receiving stations had to perform a real-time scan conversion from the RAW format to the NTSC television format, subsequently recording this on many other videotapes and kinescope films, while also broadcasting it around the world. Because the real-time broadcast was a success, and it was recorded elsewhere, these telemetry tape backup recordings of the RAW format were considered pretty low priority in the years following the mission. As a result, at some point, they were lost. Went missing. Up in smoke. Gone. What happened to them? Don't really know. NASA only realized they were missing when several still photographs in the 1990s showed the visually superior raw SSTV transmission on one of the monitors in the ground stations, prompting a search for the data tapes. However, even after a multi-year investigation led by a research team of former NASA employees and contractors, they were never found. In fact, it's very likely that they were erased and reused in the early 1980s during a data tape shortage that the Landsat program was facing. Despite never finding the tapes and no longer having the equipment to play them back due to the technology being so outdated anyway, NASA did, however, manage to uncover higher quality NTSC videotapes as well as a Super 8 film taken of a video monitor in Australia that was playing the broadcast. As a result, despite the tapes being lost, there is no footage that was ever lost, no data that was ever lost, no telemetry that was ever lost, just the raw data of a slightly better format that they've managed to meet and exceed in quality over the years anyway. S4B seismic testing. As mentioned previously, the third stage of the Saturn V, or S4B, was discarded after the lunar module was extracted from it by the CSM. Where would it go? Well, at first, discarded stages were sent into orbit of the Sun, leaving the Earth-Moon system completely and theoretically removing them as an orbital debris threat. We'll come back to that theoretically part. However, following Apollo 12, they had a new idea and began using the S4B as a scientific instrument. A new experiment was left on the lunar surface by the crew of Apollo 12, a passive seismometer experiment designed to detect vibrations on the lunar surface and use these to determine the internal structure of the moon. In addition to detecting moonquakes from within the moon, the experiment was also able to detect external sources of vibrations, such as a micrometeoroid crashing into it, or the spent third stage of a Saturn V. Following its deployment, every S4B that was sent to the moon was intentionally crashed into it, creating vibrations that the passive seismic experiment could measure. The first time this was done on Apollo 13, the stage crashed into the moon well after the oxygen tank incident, and when informed that the crash had occurred, Jim Lovell quipped, "Well, at least something went right on this mission." John Young's hot mic. Oh boy. John W. Young might be my favorite astronaut of all time. He is the only astronaut to have flown on Gemini, Apollo, and the Space Shuttle. He walked on the moon, snuck a corned beef sandwich into space, put Columbia's wheels on a runway for the very first time, and served as chief of the astronaut office for over a decade. His many achievements have left him with the modern internet moniker of the main character of spaceflight. During one of these achievements, a very human, very crude, and very funny moment occurred. Let's listen.
I got the forks again. I've got them again, Charlie. I haven't eaten this much citrus fruit in 20 years. And I'll tell you one thing. In another 12 fucking days, I ain't never eating any more. I put them up over the, right up in there. They ain't there? Oh, shit.
Orion, Houston.
Yes, sir.
Okay, John, where you have my hot mic.
How long we had that?
Apparently, the high fruit content of the Apollo astronaut diet wasn't agreeing with Young's stomach, and his announcement of the situation had been unintentionally broadcast live from the surface of the moon. There's been some debate as to the actual cause of the issue. Citrus fruit is actually less likely to give one gas than other fruits, though it is possible that some manner of artificial substitute in the food had caused it. Another possibility is tang, or rather the tang-like artificially flavored orange drinks that they were given, designed to be very high in potassium. Other astronauts throughout Apollo complained about the same issue. However, only one of them had the embarrassment of the entire world hearing about it live as it happened. Apollo subsatellites. Spaceflight loves ride-sharing. Payload designers have, over the years, gotten very good at making satellites very small and very lightweight, enough that one payload per launch system is often a case of overkill. Especially these days, it isn't uncommon for a single rocket to launch 2, 3, 4, or in the case of Starlink, over 20 satellites at a time. Artemis 1, launched in 2022, carried 10 small CubeSats inside the Orion stage adapter for deployment in lunar orbit. Project Apollo, similarly, was no stranger to ride-sharing. On Apollo 15, a subsatellite called the Apollo 15 Particles and Fields subsatellite was released out of the CSM's Scientific Instrument Module Bay, where it had been housed in a container resembling a mailbox. Designed around a hexagonal structure equipped with 3 instrument booms, the satellite was made to measure the strength and direction of cosmic magnetic fields, detect variations in the moon's gravity, and more. It was intended to operate for 1 year, and it fell short of this goal by 5 months after an electronics failure, but managed to accomplish all of its stated objectives anyway. Due to its success, the experiment was repeated on Apollo 16 with a virtually identical probe, though this one went a little differently. The CSM had problems with its service propulsion system, a subject we'll come back to, and as a result, the satellite was released in a very low lunar orbit of around 100 kilometers. The moon has an odd, uneven distribution of mass, making low orbits around it very unstable, meaning the second subsatellite crashed into the surface 34 days after the deployment. Nevertheless, it did manage to return some valuable data, especially about low altitudes, which at the time, there wasn't very much of. Apollo 15's nozzle damage. Not all of the Apollo landings touched down completely flawlessly, and Apollo 15 had a particularly bad one. Not only did the LEM touch down at a somewhat alarming angle of around 11 degrees, but the nozzle of the descent engine buckled inwards when the touchdown occurred at around 6 feet per second, faster than any other landing.
-1, 6% fuel. 10 feet, -1. 8 feet, -1. Contact. Man. Okay, Houston, the Falcon is on the plane at Hadley.
It would seem that David Scott was a little fast on the engine stop command when the contact light came on. Because they were at the edge of a crater, the landing leg closest to the ground touched before the other 3, which may have also been a factor. While we can clearly see the bell nozzle buckled and damaged in photos, there's some debate as to how this actually happened. The most obvious answer would seem to be that the nozzle struck the lunar surface itself, but there is some discussion that suggests the damage occurred from overpressure, basically the engine's exhaust hitting the ground and then bouncing back up into the nozzle. However, while it looks bad and it was probably a little unnerving, this hard landing and subsequent damage posed no difficulty to Apollo 15, as it was able to lift off and return home without any issue. Moon trash. Yeah, there's trash on the moon. Are you really surprised? Remember, spaceflight is all about saving weight. So after you've spent a few days flying to the moon, what do you do when you get there? All the food containers, food waste, and anything else that simply wasn't needed anymore was tossed on the lunar surface near the lander. You can see it in a lot of photos. It's weight that could be replaced with more moon rocks, more equipment from a surveyor probe, more experiments. Now, I can feel the environmentalist in some of you wanting to speak up. However, the moon isn't exactly what you'd call hospitable. Trash on Earth is a problem because it harms the environment, the people, the wildlife, the plant life. None of that stuff exists on the moon. It is a barren, lifeless, irradiated rock, much like it would appear a lot of the rest of our solar system, at least on the surface. When we get around to a permanent, sustained lunar presence, we can pick up the trash. We can build the first lunar trash cans around that stuff. Although, to be honest, I think all 6 landing sites should be put under glass domes and left as museum exhibits, trash and all. But we'll see. The Skylab 4 mutiny. Finally, we come back to America's first space station. The urban legend version is a far more interesting story, so let's start there. Skylab 4 was actually the third and final crew to visit the station. Skylab 1 was the station's uncrewed launch and ran for 84 days in the winter of 1973. According to the story, the astronauts aboard Skylab 3 became dissatisfied with how NASA management was delegating their daily timelines. They were being micromanaged and overworked, and as a result, they staged a strike, or a mutiny. They turned off the space station's radio, took the day off, and did whatever they pleased. However, the truth of the matter isn't as fun. The crew of Skylab 4, Gerald Carr, Edward Gibson, and William Pogue, were somewhat overworked, and had started to get a little fatigued and behind on that work. To make up for it, they made a decision that the daily briefing need only be attended by one crew member, leaving the other 2 to continue working. On one of these mornings, Gerald Carr simply forgot to turn on his radio. Skylab was out of contact with mission control for 1 orbit, though they never actually stopped working during this time. By the next planned contact period in orbit, communications had been re-established, and a discussion was held regarding the astronauts' schedules in light of their fatigue. Carr called this discussion, quote, the first sensitivity session in space. There is extensive documentation of the crew's activities during all of the days that the mutiny is alleged to have taken place, negating the claim that it ever did take place. The only source for it, in fact, is a 1980 case study by the Harvard Business School entitled Strike in Space, which stated, quote, on December 27, 1973, the third crew of the Skylab space station turned off the radio and refused to talk to mission control. There was no source for the claim of either the date or the radio being turned off. The authors acknowledged at the end of the piece that much material was drawn from Henry S.F. Cooper's book A House in Space, which expanded on a magazine article and stated the astronauts stopped working and did what they wanted for 1 day halfway through the mission. In truth, on December 27th, the crew did medical tests of their cardiovascular systems using a bicycle, conducted 7.5 hours of observations using the Apollo telescope mount, photographed ground targets in the South Atlantic, Saudi Arabia, and coastal Peru, and broadcast 3 television transmissions, among other things. The only truth to the mutiny was a communications blackout for 90 minutes because Gerald Carr was a little tired and forgot to turn on the radio. Tier 4 complete. We've only just begun to descend into lunar obscurity. Down we go, folks. Yes, I know the Apollo 12 lightning strikes are on a different tier from SCE to OX. It's just a name, don't think too hard about it. Also, from this point on, the level of obscurity becomes somewhat arbitrary. From here, it's all pretty obscure. Deep space EVAs. When we think of spacewalks, we tend to think of the Earth dominating the background. Alexei Leonov and Ed White on the world's first spacewalks, the many hours of footage from the Space Shuttle or the International Space Station. However, imagine how different it must feel if you're not 400 kilometers away from the Earth, but more like 300,000 kilometers away. The only times in history this feat has ever been performed were, of course, during Project Apollo's 3J missions. On Apollo 15, as the crew was returning to Earth, Alfred Worden suited up and exited the command module at an altitude from Earth of around 317,000 kilometers. Bear in mind, he's not floating free. He has a tether, and he's grasping handles installed specifically for this purpose as he makes his way along the service module. He was given 2 tasks. First, retrieve a set of 2 film cassettes from the service module sim bay. Second, check out the condition of the sim instruments themselves, during which he noted that 2 instruments had failed to fully retract themselves. Not an issue for re-entry, as the entire module is jettisoned from the command module well before that. This entire process took 39 minutes. On Apollo 16, Ken Mattingly performed the second deep space EVA, taking 83 minutes this time. Mattingly also retrieved film cassettes and checked the SimBay instruments, but also set up a biological experiment that examined the effects of exposure to deep space on microbial life forms. Finally, on Apollo 17, Ronald Evans spent 65 minutes outside the CSM, again retrieving the film cassettes, but this time also needing to retrieve another 70mm film cassette from the Lunar Sounder experiment, which used high-frequency and very high-frequency pulses to gather data on the moon's subsurface composition. To date, no other spacewalks have ever been performed outside of low Earth orbit. The highest would be, at a guess, any space shuttle missions to deploy or service the Hubble Space Telescope, which is 576 kilometers above the Earth. Ken Mattingly's wedding ring. Ken Mattingly lost his wedding ring on the moon. Don't worry, this story has a happy ending, I promise. Alright, he didn't lose it on the moon. He lost it on the way to the moon, on day 2 of Apollo 16. In 1970, Mattingly married Elizabeth Daly, and the two had a son together in 1972, though I can't find out if this was before or after Apollo 16. The ring Mattingly wore to symbolize that union, at some point on day 2 of the mission, simply came loose and floated off of his finger. He wasn't entirely sure when, nor where it had gone. The command module was searched top to bottom, but nobody could find it. Once the mission was making its return to Earth, Mattingly made one last attempt, searching near the module's air filters where floating objects often wound up getting stuck. However, still no avail. Mattingly concluded, "Well, I guess I lost it," and prepared for his trans-Earth spacewalk. During these spacewalks, a second astronaut would keep watch from the command module's opened hatch, and in this case, that astronaut was Charlie Duke. Duke was taking the film cassettes from Mattingly, and as Mattingly turned to climb back down to the service module, Duke said, "Well, would you look at that?" Mattingly turned back and saw Duke pointing at Mattingly's wedding ring as it floated out into space. Mattingly quickly grabbed it, putting it in his suit pocket to keep it safe until the spacewalk was over, and he kept close track of it from there on out. When Apollo 16 splashed down, it was back on his finger. Skylab Revival. We talked in the last episode about how it was originally hoped that Skylab would last longer than it had by being reboosted back into an appropriate orbit. However, we didn't go much into the details of how that would have been done. By 1974, Skylab had saw its final scheduled flight, a world record-setting 84-day stay by its third crew. After their departure, the station was vented of atmosphere, and the majority of its onboard systems were shut down. It was now dormant, waiting for the next planned phase of its operation. With the Apollo hardware being fully retired, the hope was that Skylab would eventually be reactivated and its decaying orbit boosted by the then-in-development Space Shuttle. After 4 years of complicated struggles to refine the design of the upcoming shuttle, NASA remained hopeful. In 1978, 4 pairs of astronauts began training for orbital flight test shuttle missions, and among them was Apollo 13 veteran Fred Hayes. In the press release announcing the crews, it was stated that one of these OFT flights could be made to boost Skylab into a higher orbit. However, the immensely complex space shuttle was proving slow and difficult to master the design elements of, and in 1977, engineers were predicting its systems would not be ready for a reboost mission until its 5th flight, forcing NASA to greenlight production of hardware that could boost the station by remote control. Introducing the Teleoperator Retrieval System. This goofy little boxy guy could be flown autonomously and be launched aboard the shuttle as soon as its 3rd flight. The crew would deploy it near Skylab, guide it over by remote, dock, and assess the status of the station. If it was no longer fit for crew, the TRS would fire its engine and bring it down into a controlled dive into the atmosphere, where it would break apart over empty ocean. If Skylab could be restored for future use, it would fire its engine in the other direction, inserting it into a higher storage orbit until the shuttle was able to dock with it itself. What really sealed the fate of Skylab in the end was the Space Shuttle main engine. The extremely complicated and all-new engine was rife with troubles, and in 1978, 2 test stand failures pushed its schedule permanently beyond the point of no return. The shuttle was not ready for a 1979 launch, and would in fact not fly until 1981. NASA turned to focusing its efforts on a safe re-entry path for Skylab, with mixed success. Large portions of it ended up falling over Western Australia, which we mentioned in the last video. Skylab Rescue. Staying on the Skylab train for now, Skylab Rescue was the plan to bring home astronauts in the case of an emergency. The groundwork had already been laid. There were previous plans from the Apollo program to use the CSM as a rescue vehicle to save astronauts stranded in lunar orbit. The idea was remarkably simple. The CSM could seat 3 astronauts with storage lockers on the aft bulkhead. So, taking out the lockers provided space for 2 more crew seats, bringing the total to 5. A Skylab rescue mission would launch with a crew of 2 and return with all 5. No rescue mission ever needed to be flown, however, they did come close. Skylab 3, shortly after launch, had a problem with one of its 4 RCS thrusters, causing them to lose control of it. 6 days later, on August 2, 1973, they woke up to see the craft's fuel leaking out of the thruster's nozzles on the opposite side as the other failure. They were down to 2 blocks of nozzles now, though by this time the astronauts were safely aboard Skylab, giving some time to decide what to do. The mission continued while preparations were made for a possible rescue mission by assembling a Saturn 1B and CSM, and even at one point rolling it to the launch pad. However, the mission never ended up being sent. Earlier training had already shown that a CSM was capable of deorbit with not just 2 working thruster blocks, but only 1. Skylab 3 was able to complete its 59-day mission and return to Earth safely, landing on September 25, 1973. The Soviet Soyuz Zond missions. It's a good thing we did just a brief overview of Soviet lunar programs in the first video, because it allows us to now revisit that and dig into some of the details. The Soviet lunar landing plan differed greatly from the American one, looking more like a lot of the proposed architecture for crewed missions to Mars. Rather than bringing everything you need in one launch a la the Saturn V, the Soviet idea was to assemble a lunar vehicle in Earth orbit with multiple launches of their old reliable, the R-7. Part of this program would also involve a stripped-down version of the first-generation Soyuz, the L-1, performing crewed flybys of the moon in preparation for landing. However, after Apollo 8 successfully put humans in orbit of the moon, these crewed flyby missions became low priority, worsened by the fact that the proposed Proton booster was slow to develop and far from being human-rated. In the end, the Zond spacecraft would make 5 flights from Zond 4 to 8, and 4 of these flights suffered serious malfunctions, and even more failed completely before reaching orbit. Zond 4 launched successfully to a high apogee orbit, but failed during re-entry after its guidance system malfunctioned. Zond 5 successfully flew 2 tortoises around the moon, but re-entered at an angle that would have killed any cosmonauts. It also caused a scare in the United States when, on September 19, 1968, the voices of 3 cosmonauts were intercepted by United States listening stations. The cosmonauts were reading out telemetry data and computer readings, and even discussing an attempt to land. For a brief moment, there was real fear that the Soviets were going to beat NASA to the moon. However, after looking further into it, it was realized that the communications weren't coming from the spacecraft, they were coming from the ground being routed through the spacecraft back to Earth. The spacecraft was completely without crew. The cosmonauts had been just playing a prank, and the Americans had fallen for it completely. Zond 6 crashed after a parachute failure, Zond 7 was wholly successful, but Zond 8 lost control during re-entry, and the program was cancelled in 1970. Having lost the race to the moon, political interest dwindled. The Soviets would not be going to the moon today. The Apollo Rickshaw. The proper term for it is the Modular Equipment Transporter, and prior to the lunar roving vehicle, this was what they had. Well, it was what Apollo 14 had. 11 and 12 just had their own gloved hands. The MET was a 2-wheeled, hand-pulled vehicle designed to lug around equipment and samples to and from the lunar module. The astronauts had a lot of equipment with them. Hand tools, cameras, rolls of film, bags to hold rocks, and more. It was used for only one mission, as the rover quickly made it obsolete, though it did beat the rover in having the first tires on the moon courtesy of Goodyear. Astronauts Alan Shepard and Edgar Mitchell didn't care for the rickshaw. At one point they had to pick the whole thing up and carry it together because it was unable to push through the rough terrain of the lunar surface. When it was replaced with the rover, the design called for something heavier and capable of moving farther, so the nitrogen-filled tires of the rickshaw were replaced with a wire mesh design that helped mitigate the dust problem for the rover. Gimbal lock. This is a phenomenon that occurs when a 3-axis system loses 1 degree of freedom, making it behave like a 2-axis system. Imagine you can pitch and you can roll, but you can't yaw. Or you can yaw and you can pitch, but you can't roll. It happens when 2 axes of movement are driven into a parallel configuration, causing changes to one to apply the same change to the other. So how do you fix gimbal lock? Well, the simplest solution is to add a 4th gimbal that can remain independent of the other 3 until one of them becomes locked, then taking its place. However, a 4th gimbal creates extra weight, so NASA decided to get a little clever with it. They instead designed an indicator that would trigger when the guidance was approaching a point where gimbal lock might occur, eventually freezing the entire inertial measurement unit if it got too close. Once this happens, the astronauts would then have to manually realign the system using the stars as a reference point. Both Apollo 11 and Apollo 13 experienced the problem of gimbal lock, and after Neil and Buzz had landed on the moon, Michael Collins up in lunar orbit casually requested a Christmas gift, a 4th gimbal. The Golden Camera Award. Pretty short and sweet for this one. The Golden Camera Award is an annual German film and television award held by the Funk Mediengruppe, Germany's 3rd largest newspaper and magazine publisher. Prior to 1987, the recipients of the award were almost exclusively German, But in 1972, the award was given to NASA's Ed Fendel, head of the Communications Systems section of the Flight Control Division at Johnson Space Center. The carefully timed liftoff of Apollo 17, the 360-degree pans, zooms into the astronaut as they hopped away, that's all Ed. He was the man behind the controls for the Apollo TV cameras, and his work earned him a distinguished award that was usually not given to people outside of Germany. Awesome work, Ed. Lunar motorcycle. Possibly the coolest thing to never happen on the moon. While it's commonly referred to as a possible alternative in case the LRV wasn't ready for Apollo 15, the truth is that the Apollo motorcycle was just one of several ideas evaluated for getting astronauts around on the moon. There's only a few images of these tests showing a very simplistic and squat motorcycle being tested, and some of them might actually be new images, I'm not really sure. The idea wasn't explored very far beyond that, and it's possibly for the best. Consider the extensive amounts of dust being thrown up here by the wheels of the LRV, and imagine the legs of your suit being exposed to those sharp clouds. Probably not the best idea. The Apollo 15 postal covers. Oh boy, this is a big one. In 1972, NASA took a massive hit to its reputation when the astronauts of Apollo 15 got a little greedy. Though I will add that these days, this scandal seems to have more or less been forgotten. From the beginning of the space age, commemorative postage stamps depicting spaceflight and spacecraft and satellites began to be collected by philatelers, that is to say, stamp collectors. Collectors also sought souvenirs through the form of specially designed envelopes called covers, and a particularly valuable postal cover would be one that had flown to space, or even to the moon. There was nothing specifically against the rules in regards to astronauts selling a personal item from a spaceflight, and it had in fact happened in the past, but the crew of Apollo 15 took it a little too far. They made a deal with a German stamp dealer named Hermann Seeger, who offered them each $7,000 to carry 100 postal covers to the moon, adding another 300 covers for their own usage. Again, this isn't illegal or against any rules, but it is somewhat in poor taste. It was said that the crew had turned a scientific operation into a financial one, and they had gone above one specific rule in order to do it. While the astronauts are allowed an amount of personal belongings on board each flight, these belongings had to be recorded and approved by the crew's supervisor, in this case, Mercury veteran Deke Slayton. Slayton, then known for his ironclad grip on the crews he supervised, claimed that he knew about 144 of these covers cleared to be carried by Al Worden, but he had been told it was for personal use, Worden neglecting to mention the deal with Seeger or the rest of the covers. After returning the postal covers to Earth, the astronauts left their personal ones at a Houston printer to certify and hold on to, and then began to plan a trip to Europe. Once they were on their way to Germany to receive their money from Seeger, they learned that Seeger had already sold all of the covers they had given him. At this point, astronaut David Scott stated that they were in trouble. They hadn't planned on the covers getting out into the world so early and so fast, and when they did, it was picked up by American media. A NASA investigation quickly began into what Deke Slayton had called a regular goddamn scandal. It got worse when the astronauts claimed they weren't aware any postal covers were going to be used for commercial purposes. NASA now looked careless and incompetent in the public's eye, completely unaware of what their astronauts were doing and what they were taking up into space. Astronauts in those days were practically celebrities, and the entire operation gave the impression that they were using their prestigious positions purely for profit. All 3 crew members of Apollo 15 were permanently grounded, their reputations tarnished, and the remaining postal covers confiscated. By 1977, the crew had left NASA, and then in 1983, Al Worden received a small amount of justice. NASA was planning to fly 260,000 postal covers on a space shuttle mission, and he consequently sued the US government for confiscating his covers without a hearing. The government was forced to return all of the covers to the astronauts. Launch waste disposal. We've talked already about the bags that were used for waste disposal in flight, and how most of them would end up on the surface of the moon to reduce weight. However, when they were on the launch pad, the situation changed a little. From James R. Hansen's First Man, The Life of Neil A. Armstrong, we rubbed our behinds with a special salve and pulled on what were euphemistically called fecal containment garments. Much like they did when they were in their EVA suits, the Apollo astronauts had to wear diapers, and they had to put on baby powder to keep from chafing. And they basically had to wear a catheter strapped to their hip. The entire thing sounds deeply uncomfortable, and I'm not surprised that astronauts during launches often keep their responses to mission control short and sweet. They're probably doing everything they can to not think about their soiled diapers and catheter tubes. Thankfully, once in space, they were able to take all of this off, clean up, and change into jumpsuits. Much better, though they were still doing their business into bags. Skylab B. Oh, what could have been. We've already talked about the decline and eventual demise of Skylab, and what better to remedy this issue than to simply launch another one? Well, this was considered because there actually was already 2 of them. Built in 1970 by McDonnell Douglas alongside the first one, Skylab B was a backup module that was put in storage while the first one operated and NASA tried to figure out how best to use what hardware they had left from the Apollo program. So, what would you do with Skylab Round 2 Orbital Boogaloo? Well, there were a few options. Let's run through some. One idea was to spin it. For years, the idea of achieving artificial gravity by rotating a spacecraft had been conceptualized, but never put into practice. Skylab B was one way to test the concept, but of course it never came to fruition. Other ideas involved expansion of the Apollo-Soyuz test project, creating an international Skylab serviced by both Apollo and Soyuz spacecraft, or by docking Skylab B with a Soviet Soyuz station. This latter option posed significant challenges primarily around the differences in docking adapters and spacecraft pressurization. The station could even be expanded by the space shuttle once it entered service. However, after the first Skylab module was largely successful on launch, plans for Skylab B were cancelled and it was eventually donated to museums, with its orbital workshop at the National Air and Space Museum, the airlock module at Evergreen Aviation and Space Museum, and its multiple docking adapter at the KSC Visitors Complex. Jim Irwin's near heart attack. There are few places I can imagine more frightening to develop a serious medical condition than while you're orbiting the moon, but that's what happened to Jim Irwin on Apollo 15. After the moonwalking was complete and Irwin had returned to the CSM, he was busy moving rock samples and other items into the command module when the flight surgeons began to notice some irregularities in his heart rhythms. Irwin and David Scott had been working with no sleep for 23 hours at this point, and what the flight surgeons saw were actually the earliest symptoms of a heart condition that would plague Irwin for the rest of his life. As the symptoms worsened, Deputy Director Chris Kraft was told, "It's serious. If he were on Earth, I'd have him in ICU being treated for a heart attack." Though Irwin wasn't directly having a heart attack, his arrhythmia was bad enough that, if he was on Earth, he'd have been at high risk for one. In a stroke of luck, Irwin had actually developed these symptoms in the best possible conditions. He was in zero gravity, reducing strain on his heart muscles, he was breathing 100% oxygen in the cabin, and he was being continuously monitored. In a way, he already was in an ICU. He had little else to do during the rest of the trip home, which gave him the opportunity to relax and recover. His heart rhythm returned to normal all the way to splashdown, though the condition would rear its ugly head later in his life when he suffered 3 major heart attacks. The final one in 1991 would take his life, and he would become the first of the 12 men to walk on the moon to die. Retrograde orbits. It may surprise you to know that every Apollo mission that orbited the moon did so essentially backwards. That is to say, in the opposite direction of the moon's rotation. It may seem counterintuitive, as going with the rotation of a body's spin is used to save some fuel expense caused by fighting against it. The moon, however, rotates very slowly, roughly once every 27 days, and the retrograde orbits were more about going against the orbit of the moon. If they had approached from the other direction, they would effectively slingshot around it and, if no changes were made, accelerate further into deep space. However, approaching retrograde allowed for a free return trajectory, which is a trajectory that will eventually lead back to Earth if no changes were made, or more importantly, no changes could be made. It was all about optimization, and in this particular case, traveling backwards was the optimum path. Where is Snoopy? Snoopy was the nickname given to the LEM for Apollo 10, while the CSM was called Charlie Brown. Snoopy is the only once crewed spacecraft to still be in outer space without a crew. Well, at least half of it. The bottom half, the descent stage, was jettisoned in lunar orbit, and its current location is unknown, though there's really only 2 options. It's either still in orbit of the moon to this day, or the uneven mass distribution of the moon has pulled it down and it has crashed. The ascent stage, however, used its remaining fuel to burn past the moon and into orbit of the sun, the only time an Apollo LEM did so. After the mission was over, Snoopy's ascent stage was not tracked, and it disappeared. Amateur astronomers have spent the following decades trying to locate it, and in 2011, a group of astronomers in the UK started an official project to look for it. After several false alarms, in 2019, the Royal Astronomical Society announced that they had probably found it. A small Earth-crossing object labeled 2018 AV2 is believed to be Snoopy with 98% certainty. Snoopy's still out there, orbiting the sun and occasionally crossing paths with the Earth again. Maybe someday she'll come all the way home. The Apollo 17 LRV Fender. Would it surprise you to know that the first automobile on the moon was used only twice before it had a traffic accident? Well, sort of. It didn't crash into anything. John Young crashed into it, accidentally knocking off the rear fender extension on Apollo 16. Then on Apollo 17, it happened again with Gene Cernan when he bumped a fender extension with a hammer handle. Remembering the enormous amount of dust thrown up without the fender to block it on the previous mission, the crew were determined to repair it this time. First, the astronauts attempted to simply tape the fender extension back on, but the sheer amount of dust made getting the tape to stick virtually impossible. So NASA returned to its historic days of Apollo 13 and fixed the problem with duct tape. They constructed a replacement fender out of some EVA maps, duct taped together, and a pair of clamps intended to mount an overhead light that fastened the extension to the rest of the fender. It worked for the duration of the mission, and the work was all undone afterwards, bringing the pieces back to Earth. The maps and duct tape are now on display at the National Air and Space Museum, still with cuts and abrasions from the sharp lunar dust. Sneaker test. How do you test a rocket's ability to withstand things like high winds while it's sitting on the launch pad? Well, you shake it. And how do you do such a thing? Well, in the days of the shuttle, this kind of thing was done with machines and a test stand. However, Apollo had a slightly cheaper and low-tech idea. Push it with your feet. On one side, engineers would group together and shove the side of the rocket with their shoes, hence sneaker test, while engineers on the other side would pull the rocket with a rope. Simple, yet effective. The Bart Sibrel Punch. Maybe my favorite thing an Apollo astronaut has ever done while they were on Earth. In 2004, conspiracy theorist Bart Sibrel released a film called Astronauts Gone Wild, an investigation into the authenticity of the moon landings. This was a follow-up to his wildly successful 2001 film, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, in which Sibrel lied about receiving secret footage and what it showed. In this follow-up, Sibrel tried to pull a fast one on some of the Apollo astronauts. He made up some false press credentials and stalked and harassed 8 of the astronauts, demanding that each of them swear upon a Bible that he had actually gone to the moon. Most of the astronauts, Michael Collins, Neil Armstrong, John Young, and Al Worden, refused his request. 3 of them, Alan Bean, Gene Cernan, and Edgar Mitchell, did as they were asked and swore on the Bible, and Sibrel still claimed they were lying. One of the astronauts, Edwin Buzz Aldrin Jr., took it a step further and did what all of the others clearly wanted to do. After he declined Sibrel's demand, he tried to walk away. Sibrel followed him, berating him and continuing his demand. Eventually, he made his biggest mistake. He stood before a veteran of 66 combat missions during the Korean War, and he called that veteran a coward.
Come with me, Buzz.
You really like attention, don't you? You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if I ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself. Away from me. You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
Oh, that's good, isn't it? Let's watch that again.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
A couple more times.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief and a thief and a thief.
Once more. I have watched that clip more times than I can count. Of course, Sibrel tried to have Aldrin charged, however the police declined to press those charges. A 72-year-old war veteran and astronaut just clocked Sibrel in the jaw, and the world said, shame about that. Anyway. Worth noting that several years later, Bart Sibrel was arrested himself for stomping on the hood of a car during a parking dispute. That's the kind of person he is. Saturn V derivatives. Oh boy. We've talked about derivatives before. I highly advise watching the Space Shuttle Iceberg to learn more about how those work, and of course, if you build the most powerful rocket in the world at the time, people are going to have ideas on how to improve or change it. There were a lot of these derivative ideas over the years, though none would ever leave paper and enter the real world. Let's go through just a few of these options. The Saturn Shuttle was one of many concepts for launching the Space Shuttle orbiter during its preliminary design days. The idea was to use a Saturn V first stage, the S1C, and replace the second stage, the S2, with the shuttle's external fuel tank, mounting the orbiter on the side of it. The S1C would perform the functions of the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, which do the majority of the heavy lifting during the early phases of ascent. The second stage would ignite the shuttle's engines mid-flight, something the Space Shuttle main engine ended up not being capable of actually doing, and finish the ride to orbit. Adding wings and landing gear to the S-1C would allow it to fly back to a runway and be reused in addition to the orbiter, leaving the only discarded component, the external tank, much like the finalized shuttle design. However, the proposed design wouldn't be able to reuse the F-1 engines, needing to replace them for each flight, which was seen as a major drawback. Another proposed Saturn V derivative was the Saturn V-B. Designed to be a smaller but more efficient stage-and-a-half booster, this one works similarly to the Atlas rocket. 5 F-1 engines would act as the first stage, and then 4 of the engines and their skirt and mounting hardware would fall away, leaving one engine to act as a sustainer and finish the job. The first stage engines could then be recovered via parachutes and reused. These two designs are only the tip of what could be another iceberg of designs based around the mighty Saturn V, but I can't go on forever. At least one more of these designs will be discussed later in this iceberg, but for now, just know that many ideas existed, and not all of them were good. The MEM, or Mars Excursion Module. With the incredible achievement of landing humans on the moon, there were a lot of people who thought that we weren't going to stop there. Expecting to be able to land humans on Mars by the 1990s, NASA made a number of spacecraft development studies around crewed Mars vehicles, and a popular one was the MEM. Inspired directly by the Apollo Lunar Excursion Module, the MEM was a 2-stage craft that would include a descent stage to land on the surface, a short-stay surface habitat, and an ascent stage that would use the descent stage as a launch pad, just like Apollo. There was also a proposed cargo MEM that would consist of only the descent stage and the habitat turned cargo hold for delivering supplies, rovers, or even a proposed nuclear reactor and expanded living quarters. The design evolved over time as robotic exploration of Mars began, removing a lifting body that the Mariner spacecraft had proved would be ineffective and adopting a more gumdrop-like Apollo design. However, as we all know, crewed missions to Mars have been very sadly pushed to the back burner of spaceflight. One day we will land there, but it's very unlikely that we'll be using this design first conceived in the 1960s. Barbie's Ken on the Moon. This last one is just kind of a space Twitter meme. You see, there's a lot of degeneracy on Twitter. A lot of foolish people. Many of them, anytime the Apollo program is mentioned, rush out of the woodwork frothing at the mouth and desperate to tell everyone about how it's all a hoax. In the first part of this video, I discussed how absurd I find Apollo hoax claims and how easy they are to dismantle, but there's one claim that's become so frequent that it served to discredit the people who believe this kind of stuff before they even speak. Over 60 times now, we have found the claim that behind-the-scenes footage of Apollo 11 has been leaked to the public, proving once and for all that the missions were filmed on a stage. However, that's not Neil Armstrong. That's Ryan Gosling, filming the 2018 film First Man. Probably 2 or 3 times a month now, maybe more, we come across this video, to a point where there's an entire Twitter account dedicated to counting the number of times this claim has been made. That's how little those who cry hoax actually investigate their claims. They don't even notice the modern clothes, the digital clapboard, or Ryan freaking Gosling staring them in the face. Living in a CSM. This is a cool thing I didn't know about, which occurred early in the Apollo program before manned flights were being performed. One of the things that needed to be verified in order to make the Apollo hardware flight-worthy was whether or not it could support a crew in the environment of space. So how do you do that without actually sending it to space? Well, you construct a thermal vacuum chamber, put the CSM in it, and put the astronauts in the CSM. Then you remove all of the air pressure from the room, and then you wait. Also, you blast some bright lights at it to simulate unfiltered sunlight. This was done twice prior to Apollo 1 with 2 different crews. An unmanned test was performed first, ironing out certain kinks like a leak in the CM's side crew hatch and ice buildup in the water system. Then, Donald R. Garrett, Joel M. Rosenwig, and Neil B. Anderson entered a CSM for a second crude thermal test, remaining inside for 182 hours. During this time, the test was delayed by a problem with the emergency repressurization system of the vacuum chamber, an issue with the chamber's solar simulators resulted in several holds, and the urine dump line froze, forcing the crew to store their waste on board. Condensation formed on the CM's windows as water condensed between the layers of the glass panes, and frozen water blocked the fuel cell's hydrogen purge line. During a thunderstorm that even the crew was able to hear, the CSM lost power, forcing them to don their spacesuits. The power returned a few minutes later, and the crew realized that they had all been trying to put on different parts of the same suit in the dark. They were all greatly relieved when they were able to finally leave after just over a week inside. After the test, a laundry list of hardware changes were put forth and implemented, and a second test was scheduled. At the request of Mercury astronaut and director of flight crew operations Deke Slayton, one of the crew members, Joseph P. Kerwin, was a medical doctor chosen to better keep track of the crew's health. He was joined by Joseph Galliano and Edward Givens for the second test in October of 1966, which experienced much more minor issues over a similar week-long period and paved the way for manned flights to take place. Skylab Gemini Hatch. Exiting the Skylab orbital workshop by way of the airlock module required utilizing a hatch from a Gemini spacecraft. Despite Skylab being a mostly Apollo-era design, this hatch is a prime example of one of the ways NASA frequently appears to cut down on program costs: hardware reuse. The hatch was sold to politicians as a way to make Skylab seem more affordable, but in reality, using the Gemini hatch required serious redesign work. The airlock module had been designed as a cylinder, and the Gemini hatch was built as part of a conical structure. The hatch wound up being placed on the side of the airlock module, and you can practically see all of the better options that were ignored in order to maintain a thrifty public image. NASA used to be very clever about this kind of stuff. Apollo Venus Flyby. Oh yeah, this was a real idea. The manned Venus flyby was a 1967 proposal to send 3 astronauts on a flyby mission of the planet Venus. It was part of the Apollo Applications program, which aimed to develop scientific human spaceflight missions using hardware developed for the Apollo program. This was a wacky time in NASA's history, and some of the AAP ideas are pretty out there. We'll talk about more of them, but at the end of the day, the only part of the AAP that would survive the severe slashes to the post-Apollo budget would be Skylab, as well as the Apollo telescope mount on Skylab, and honestly that's probably for the best, though it is fun to imagine an Apollo CSM flying past Venus. About that. The plan was to use a Saturn V to send the crew on a year-long flight, which required the S4B, the third stage, to be used as a wet workshop. What is a wet workshop? I'm so glad you asked. The idea is simple, yet at the same time extremely complicated. Use a large upper stage to reach your destination, then while in space, convert those spent fuel tanks into a habitable module for long-duration spaceflights. Skylab itself was originally conceptualized as a wet workshop, but would instead be converted into a habitable module before launch and be ready for use as soon as it reached orbit. So the plan was to use the S4B as living quarters and a workshop after the remaining propellant was vented into space, using the smaller oxygen tank as waste storage. A lot of the equipment for conversion would be placed inside the tank itself, while pieces that would not survive immersion in liquid hydrogen would be placed inside the S4B interstage, usually reserved for a lunar lander. For course corrections, the Apollo Service propulsion system was replaced with 2 side-mounted LM descent propulsion systems. There's a lot more to say about the manned Venus flyby, but honestly it might require its own video as it's pretty extensive. It never happened, and honestly that's probably for the best. There are so many ways it could have gone horribly wrong. The Golden Olive Branch. There are a lot of sentimental and symbolic items left on the moon by the Apollo astronauts. One of these is a gold olive branch, a traditional symbol of peace, less than half a foot in length, left on the surface by Neil Armstrong during Apollo 11, though I can't find any information about exactly where or when it was placed, though I can confirm it wasn't placed near the plaque due to a photo we'll see later. Even more frustrating, there doesn't seem to be a single photo of the real branch on the moon, just this replica. Continuing the theme of frustration, you may have heard an internet rumor that the Apollo spacesuit was designed by none other than famous bra makers Playtex, which seems silly at first but actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. However, the truth, as usual, isn't as interesting. Playtex is a modern name for the ILC, or International Latex Corporation. The ILC initially made a variety of latex products, from swimwear and baby pants to girdles and bathing caps, but during World War II became a key contractor for attack boats, life rafts, and canteens. In 1947, the ILC split into 4 divisions, one of which would become ILC Dover, initially a metals division. In 1965, NASA put out a contract for the Apollo program to design, manufacture, and test a next-generation lunar spacesuit. Other prospective contractors included Hamilton Standard, who would end up making the life support backpacks for the Apollo program, and B.F. Goodrich, who had made the Mark IV spacesuits of Project Mercury. However, ILC Dover won the contract and proceeded to do their best to provide a suit that was not only functional and safe, but provided a new degree of flexibility that would be required while walking on the moon. The company would go on to make the modern extravehicular mobility units in conjunction with Hamilton Standard for the Space Shuttle and International Space Station spacewalks, and would also design the airbag system used to land the Mars Pathfinder, Spirit, and Opportunity missions. So, at the end of the day, did a bra maker make the Apollo spacesuits? Well, technically yes, but that bra maker also made canteens, military boats, industrial protective suits, hazmat suits, M40 and M42 field masks, and a lot more. People tend to forget that a lot of large corporations have a wide array of products they produce. Does anyone remember this ad by Chrysler? The Apollo 5 anomalies. Apollo 5 was the first uncrewed test flight of the LEM, which launched on a Saturn 1B in 1967 after significant delays. The objective was to verify the operational capabilities of the LEM, including testing both the descent and ascent engines. In particular, they wanted to do what they called a fire in the hole test, which involved firing the ascent engine while the two stages were still attached to one another. This is a requirement that would be involved in the event of an aborted lunar landing. The descent stage would be shut down, power and control quickly switched to the ascent stage, and the ascent engine would be fired before the two were separated. Extra testing involved verifying that the LM engines could be restarted after their first burn, as well as testing the instrument unit of the launch vehicle in its Saturn V configuration, despite this being a Saturn 1B launch. However, as usual with the early phases of these kinds of old programs, everything didn't quite go as planned. The LM separated from its adapter 43 minutes into the flight, and after 2 orbits, the first of 2 burns was started. Intending to last 39 seconds, the engine suddenly shut down after only 4 seconds when the Apollo guidance computer detected insufficient velocity. It was eventually realized that this occurred because the engine's valves weren't armed until it was time to ignite the engine, which meant that there was a lag while the propellant was flowing through the valves. Had such a thing occurred on a crewed mission, flight controllers believed the astronauts could have analyzed the situation and found a fix if necessary. The flight proceeded with the fire in the hole test, completing all required burns despite serious communications difficulties, knowing that if this test wasn't completed, Project Apollo would be delayed even further than it already had been. After 8 hours, a problem with the guidance computer resulted in the entire craft spinning out of control, but by then, all objectives had been achieved and the flight was a complete success. The LEM was left to spin for a few more days before it burned up in the Earth's upper atmosphere. The Apollo 1 mission patch. While we covered the tragedy of Apollo 1 in the first part, remember that it was only called Apollo 1 after the fact. Officially, at the time, the mission was designated AS-204. However, the name of Apollo 1 was thought up well before the incident, and we can tell because the crew can be seen wearing the patch. They designed it, much like every other Apollo mission patch was designed by the crew, focusing on the orbital element, as it was supposed to be the first orbital flight of the program. There was some question at the time of design as to whether or not the name Apollo 1 would stick, resulting in NASA Administrator George Low withdrawing approval for the patch, stating that it may need to be revised if the mission designation was changed. An interesting side note is that the actual artist of the patch, Alan Stevens of Rockwell International, was largely unknown until 2008. Stevens retired in 1978, and at the time, his name wasn't widely publicized with the release of the mission patches. He passed away in 1994, and a space history enthusiast named Noah Bradley purchased a box on eBay that contained a number of Stevens' documents, including the mission patches. From then on, it became publicly available knowledge that Alan Stevens was responsible for the patches of Apollo 1, 7, 9, and 10. J002E3. On September 3, 2002, amateur astronomer Bill Young discovered an unusual object in space. Initially believing it to be an asteroid, the object was designated J002E3, and it was quickly realized that the object was orbiting Earth. This is the unusual part, as the Moon is the only large object orbiting the Earth, and anything else would have been ejected out of the Earth-Moon system by perturbations of gravity caused by the Earth, Moon, and the Sun. Therefore, it was likely that J002E3 had entered orbit of Earth relatively recently. Study of the object began, examining its orbital path and tracing it back through time. J002E3 had been orbiting the Earth for 31 years and had last been near Earth in 1971. Spectrographic examination revealed that it was definitely not an asteroid, as the evidence suggested it had the same light-absorbing properties as aluminum, black paint, and white paint. It was part of a Saturn V. In fact, it is almost definitely the S4B from Apollo 12. Originally believing the object to be from Apollo 14, NASA stated they knew where all hardware from Apollo 14 is, so it couldn't be, especially not the S4B, which had been crashed into the Moon and registered on the Apollo 12 seismometer experiment. The Apollo 12 S4B, however, was sent into orbit of the Sun. Or so NASA had thought. An extra long burn of the ullage motors, which are used to push fuel toward the aft end of the rocket, meant that venting the remaining fuel didn't actually give the S4B enough energy to be ejected out of the Earth-Moon system, instead simply being sent into a very high and very unstable orbit around the Earth. In June of 2003, J002E3 appeared to leave Earth orbit and enter its intended solar orbit, but it may return sometime in the mid-2040s. It's entirely possible that one day, that S4B might re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. However, with a mass of around 14 tons, it's entirely insignificant, as objects that size burn up in Earth's atmosphere roughly 10 times a year, with almost nothing surviving to ever reach the ground. Cernun's lunar initials. Returning to the subject of unusual things left on the moon, Gene Cernan was the last human being to walk on the moon, stepping back into the LEM for the last time on December 13, 1972. However, before doing so, he bent down in the lunar dust, stuck his finger into it, and carefully etched 3 letters, TDC, the initials of his daughter Tracy. A popular belief was that he had carved the initials into a rock on the moon, but he didn't really need to. With no atmosphere to blow the dust around, the letters are very likely still on the moon to this day, right where Cernan had left them, assuming they were far enough away from the LEM to not get blasted by the ascent stage. The Genesis Rock. Officially named Sample 15415, the Genesis Rock was retrieved from Spur Crater on the moon by Apollo 15 astronauts Jim Irwin and David Scott during the second DVA. It's one of the oldest lunar samples recovered during Apollo, and was originally thought to be a piece of the moon's primordial crust. It was later discovered to be around 4.1 billion years old and formed after the moon's crust had solidified. However, it remains an interesting geological find, as its composition is that of an anorthosite, a type of igneous rock that are not fully understood even on Earth, their formation being somewhat mysterious in the geology world. Speaking of geology, "It's orange" was the exclamation made by Jack Schmitt on Apollo 17 upon discovering a spot of lunar soil that was, you guessed it, colored orange.
Oh, hey! Wait a minute. What? Where are the reflections? I've been fooled once. There is orange soil. Well, don't move it till I see it. It's all over. Orange! Don't move it till I see it. I've stirred it up with my feet. Hey, it is! I can see it from here. It's orange. Wait a minute, let me put my visor up. It's still orange. Sure it is. Crazy. Orange.
Found at Shorty Crater, which is located roughly right here, the glass-like orange regolith was later identified as a pyroclastic deposit, otherwise known as the result of volcanic activity. The material is around 3.6 billion years old, and is a relic from a time on the moon that is older than the dinosaurs, just sitting there on the surface waiting for us to find it. Also, can we take a moment and appreciate the childlike wonder and excitement in the astronauts' voices as they found it? Replay that tape.
There is orange soil. It's all over. Orange. Hey, it is. I can see it from here. It's orange. Wait a minute, let me put my visor up. It's still orange. Orange. I've got to dig a trench, Houston.
Are you ready for the shortest item on this entire iceberg? Here we go. Buzz's mom's maiden name. Buzz Aldrin's mother was born Marion Moon. Just one of those weird little coincidences, like the fact that the fastest man in the world just happens to be named Bolt. The Moon Museum. Back to the subject of weird things left on the moon, this one is only a maybe. The Moon Museum is a small piece of ceramic only 3/4 of an inch in width, containing 6 pieces of, art from prominent artists of the 1960s. Allegedly, the ceramic was secretly attached to the leg of the Intrepid lander on Apollo 12, though the astronauts never confirmed if it was actually there. After the end of the Apollo program, a number of technicians came forward and confessed that, in the layers of gold blankets which wrapped much of the LEM descent stage, they had placed small personal artifacts to be taken to the moon, but the museum was out in the open. Sculptor Forrest Myers, one of the 6 artists, was behind the idea and tried to get the project sanctioned by NASA. While he never got actual approval, he was also never actually told no, and ended up smuggling the museum to the LEM through a Grumman engineer he was friends with. While technically the first piece of art on the moon, most of it isn't very good, likely due to the small amount of canvas the artist had to work with, and I'm also going to take this opportunity to mention that I hate Andy Warhol. I think he's a hack fraud, and it's annoying that because of him, there's now probably a drawing of a dick on the moon that looks like a 12-year-old drew it. SPS/AJ-10 engine. Take a quick look at the service propulsion system, the engine on the bottom of the Apollo service module. Now take a quick look at the 2 orbital maneuvering systems engines on the back of Space Shuttle Discovery. And now, take a look at the bottom of the Orion spacecraft during Artemis 1 in 2022. You may have deduced this by now, but these are all effectively the same engine. The Rocketdyne AJ-10 is one of the most versatile rocket engines in spaceflight history, being first developed for the second stage of the Vanguard rocket and then later being uprated for the Atlas Able and Thor Able rocket, the former of which launched the Pioneer probes towards the moon. It was then uprated again and used for the Titan III's upper stage, and then once more for the Apollo service propulsion system. This was the first time the engine used Aerozine 50 for fuel and nitrogen tetroxide for oxidizer, as previous iterations used nitric acid and unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine. Both are hypergolic fuels, allowing them to be stored at room temperature, making them ideal for longer duration spaceflights. As a result, they again became the obvious choice for the shuttle's OMS engines, which would need to make correction and deorbit burns throughout the course of a 2-week mission. When the shuttle was retired, and what would eventually become the Artemis program tried to make use of any leftover hardware, the AJ-10 was chosen yet again, this time actually repurposing the shuttle's OMS engines for use as the Orion main engine. The Artemis 1 OME flew 19 times on 3 different orbiters, Challenger, Atlantis, and Discovery, and the Artemis 2 OME flew 6 times on Space Shuttle Atlantis. The AJ-10 is in many ways the workhorse of American launch vehicles and spacecraft, being there from the very beginning and sticking with us until this very day. Jack Black's mom. You may be surprised to learn that Judith Love Cohen, mother of Hollywood actor and musician Jack Black, was an aerospace engineer who worked for North American Aviation and Space Technology Laboratories, which was later acquired by Northrop Grumman. Her work across her impressive career included the guidance computer for the Minuteman missile and the abort guidance system of the Apollo lunar module. This computer ended up playing a crucial role in the safe return of Apollo 13, as it was the best available system to use most of the return trip given the power constraints of the situation. While her work clearly was amazing and helped enable the safe return of the astronauts, there's one urban legend about all of this that simply isn't true. This meme here states that Cohen was working an Apollo 13 problem when she went into labor, and after giving birth to Jack Black, sent the fix to NASA. There's one simple problem with this. Apollo 13 occurred in April of 1970, and Jack Black was born on August 28, 1969. The Apollo 7 mutiny. It seems that those earlier vacuum tests didn't quite iron out all of the kinks that would occur on longer duration Apollo flights. Apollo 7, the first crewed flight to occur after the disastrous Apollo 1, was practically a live stress test, requiring the astronauts to remain in the CSM for nearly 11 days. The crew was Commander Wally Schirra, veteran of the Mercury program, Command Module pilot Don Isley, and Lunar Module pilot Walter Cunningham, even though this flight didn't actually carry a lunar module. Liftoff of Apollo 7 went according to plan, despite high winds, as did the first few objectives, including rendezvous with the S-4B after it drifted away, and firing the SPS engine for the first time. Wally Schirra developed a cold, and his previous wishes to abort due to the high winds caused a tug-of-war over command decisions for the rest of the mission. The crew didn't like the sleep schedule, as it required someone to be awake at all times, making it difficult for the other two to rest, or for the one to be very productive. The mission's first television broadcast was delayed again to make way for the mission's primary objectives. Schirra said, quote, "You've added 2 burns to this flight schedule, and you've added a urine water dump, and we have a new vehicle up here, and I can tell you at this point, TV will be delayed without any further discussion until after the rendezvous." On day 8, Mission Control asked the crew to try a new procedure with the guidance computer, which caused it to freeze. The astronauts blamed this on Mission Control, as well as other things such as the craft's stability in orbit, the decision to keep helmets off during re-entry, and more. Flight Director Christopher Kraft called their behavior insubordination and demanded an explanation from Schirra. He later said, quote, "Schirra was exercising his commander's right to have the last word, and that was that." Despite the difficulties, Apollo 7 was a complete success in terms of achieving its goals, and paved the way for Apollo 8 and the impending success of landing a man on the moon. That's Tier 6 done. 2 more to go. Into obscurity we go. I'm not even going to explain the next tier's name, I'm just going to say, watch For All Mankind. Regardless of how you feel about the later directions it takes, that first season is kind of a masterpiece. S-tier television. AJ-260. Another one of those things that might have been cool, but never quite made it off the ground. The Aerojet 260 was an experimental solid rocket motor constructed and tested in the mid-1960s as a possible first stage of a Saturn 1B, which would significantly uprate its performance. At an absurd 17.6 meganewtons of thrust, and named for the diameter of its chamber, just over 21 feet across, it is the single largest rocket motor ever tested. The tests were performed from a new facility in Florida, and reportedly, the tests were so massive and bright that they could be seen from Miami, 31 miles away. However, the engine was never selected for use by anyone, and after its third and final test, was left abandoned in its firing pit. As of the 1990s, it was still there, but as the source I got this from is 30 years out of date, I would not be surprised if it had been removed by now. S1D SSTO. This is where I need to admit I made a mistake building this Iceberg. The S1D is the designation of the booster on the Saturn V-B, which we discussed in the previous episode. So, oops. I guess all I'll mention is that when proposed, the S1D was advertised as an SSTO, or a single stage to orbit. This isn't quite true though, since it would drop 4 of its engines and the skirt during ascent. The plan was to reuse these engines through parachute recovery, but it's still technically not an SSTO. The more appropriate term would be stage and a half, much like the old Atlas booster. Kennedy's doubts. We often talk about President Kennedy and how his charismatic speeches did a lot of heavy lifting for Project Apollo. He said we'd choose to go to the moon before the decade is out, and after his death in 1963, everyone involved in the program worked hard to honor that wish. However, what we don't talk about often is his uncertainty about the program, which was expressed much more privately. In a closed-door cabinet meeting on November 21, 1962, Kennedy voiced a number of concerns that were secretly recorded and later transcribed. Quote, "We're talking about these fantastic expenditures which wreck our budget and all these other domestic programs, and the only justification for it, in my opinion, to do it in this time or fashion, is because we hope to beat them and demonstrate that starting behind, as we did a couple years, by God, we pass them." His primary concern seemed to be priorities, feeling that the large expenditures of Apollo completely dwarfed more immediate problems at home, but the recording also highlighted that overall, Kennedy didn't see very much value in the American space program beyond political value. "We choose to go to the moon not because it's scientifically important, but because we can beat the Soviets to it. It's just one of those subtle reminders that no politician should ever be really, truly deified." Keyhole surgery. Thank you to Scott Manley for this Iceberg item and for the information on it. This refers to a solution for something that happened on Apollo 11. You may recall that Apollo 11 landed with a very small amount of fuel remaining in the descent stage, though it turns out the actual amount was somewhat exaggerated. As the propellant sloshed around in the fuel tanks, the low end of the fuel met the low fuel sensor, causing it to trigger around 30 seconds early. A fix was implemented in the form of a cylindrical perforated baffle, but the lunar module for Apollo 14 had already been assembled. The time crunch of the Apollo program wouldn't allow for them to completely disassemble and reassemble the LEM. The solution? Roll the thin, malleable metal of the baffle up as tight as possible, fit it through a 2.5-inch hole in the bottom of the tank, and then once inside, it would pop out and then be assembled and properly fitted from outside of the tank. An impressive feat of very precise surgery on a very complicated machine, and it worked. The new baffle effectively mitigated false readings from propellant slosh. Winged Apollo. Look at it. Just look at it. This was a concept patented in 1967 for a shuttle-like vehicle created out of the Apollo Command and Service Module. It would use a pair of wings that folded into the sides of the service module to assist with glide, and would also drop off the SPS engine bell, leaving a smaller nozzle better suited for lower altitudes. Its forward landing gear was a wheel, but the main gear at the back was a pair of landing skids much like the X-15. It would function effectively like a miniature space shuttle, with most of the service module converted into a cargo bay for payload delivery and satellite servicing. But the real question, would this thing even fly? No, absolutely not. Well, maybe? A lot of people were skeptical of the space shuttle's ability to glide, and while it did fall like a brick, it still hit the runway more or less like a normal plane. So maybe this idea wasn't so crazy after all. Unfortunately, we'll never know, as it never left paper. Jumper cables. Another contribution from Mr. Manley. This was a procedure that was meant to jumpstart the ascent engine of the lunar module, the design of which focused on working absolutely every single time. Should all of that complex design work fail and the engine be unable to start, there were cables called ED adapter cables that could be connected to batteries on the LEM that aren't intended to power the ascent stage, but could, theoretically, power the engine. The whole procedure is very intricate and cautious, and I'll be honest, Scott's video covers it much better, but I will mention this part. The procedure ended by needing to have the LEM surface access hatch opened to space when the ascent engine fires, with the jumper cables hanging out the door.
So when the time comes and they launch, they will obviously fire all the explosive devices, sever the module, it will take off, and they will be flying into space with the hatch open, kind of like driving down the highway with your window open for extra ventilation, except this is the reverse. You've got the cables will be dangling out the bottom.
Absolute space cowboy stuff. The smell of the moon. What exactly does the surface of the moon smell like? And of course, how exactly can you smell something in a place that you can't breathe?
Okay, Magazine Bravo is going on the commander's camera. I just tried to blow off the dust, Tony.
Well, obviously, you bring some of it back inside with you. After Apollo 11 had gathered its first lunar samples and stored them in the LEM, Neil and Buzz took off their helmets. They were immediately met with a, quote, pungent metallic smell, something like gunpowder or the smell in the air after a firecracker has gone off. Why does it smell like that? Not entirely certain. It's possible that the smell was activated by the oxygen inside the lander, since reactions with oxygen are what create combustion smells here on Earth. On a basic level, it makes sense to me. We're talking about rocks that have been pulverized into tiny pieces of almost glass by millions of years of impacts, and baking in unfiltered solar radiation. Of course it smells like something exploded there. Why wouldn't it? A16 no-circ burn. This refers to something that happened on Apollo 16 after the lunar module had undocked from the CSM and was preparing for landing. A number of problems occurred. First, the LEM's high-gain antenna stopped responding on its yaw axis, something that was never fixed, as well as a problem with the RCS thrusters. As soon as these issues had been dealt with, Ken Mattingly aboard the CSM found a new problem. The service propulsion system's backup gimbal, when he had tested it, caused the spacecraft to shake violently. Something was very wrong, and at the time, the crew was on the lunar far side, unable to communicate with mission control. The ground rules as they stood were that the CSM would not perform a circularization burn at this time and would instead do a, quote, brute force rendezvous at the high point of the orbit, bringing the two crafts back together. However, Mission Commander John Young considered what this rendezvous burn would do to the low point of the orbit and told Mattingly to wait until Mission Control could advise them. The advisement was to perform the rendezvous, and for a period of time, Young and Duke thought they weren't going to land on the moon. They waited for 2 hours while Houston diagnosed the issues, and at hour 102 of the mission, were given a go to perform the landing. The timeline of the mission had shifted a little, but Apollo 16 still performed and still succeeded in all of its goals. Harrison Schmidt's allergies. First of all, Jack's last name is misspelled on this iceberg, and I'm sorry for that. Second, what do you think Jack discovered he was allergic to? Not a lot of options on an Apollo mission. He was allergic, it turned out, to the lunar regolith. After their first EVA, Jack and Jean returned to the lunar module and took off their helmets. Immediately upon doing so and breathing in the moon dust, Jack's nose became swollen and he had trouble breathing. It was immediately apparent to Cernan, as it was bad enough that it had changed the sound of Jack's voice. By the fourth time he had to inhale it, the effects weren't so bad, but still noticeable. After getting home, Schmidt noticed a flight surgeon have the same reaction he did while taking the suits out of the command module, such a bad reaction in fact that he had to stop what he was doing and take a moment to recover. Theirs and Schmidt's case have become a case study into health effects caused by lunar regolith and will likely be key to finding solutions during the Artemis program. It's a dangerous, desolate, and dusty world up there on the moon. Radioactive switches. Would it surprise you to know that the tips of every single switch inside the Apollo LEM was just a little bit radioactive? Well, they were. Why? So that the astronauts could see them. The flight-ready switch tips were installed very late in the assembly sequence to minimize exposure, but were made with radioluminescent material encased in clear plastic. Basically, they were glow-in-the-dark, allowing for them to be found in less than ideal lighting conditions. They posed little risk to the crew unless they happened to break, which they did before the launch of Apollo 11. During some panel rework, the plastic tips of several switches were compromised and radiation spread throughout the LM's interior, requiring a significant cleanup effort. Further rules were put in place regarding their handling after this incident. Alan Shepard on Apollo 13. You may remember in the Apollo 13 film that Jim Lovell states he has been moved to Apollo 13's prime crew because, quote, Al Shepard's ear infection flared up.
Al Shepard's ear infection has flared up. We've all been bumped up to the prime crew of Apollo 13.
This isn't quite what happened. Alan Shepard, the first American in space, did have an inner ear problem. However, a new surgery was developed to treat this in 1969, and Shepard was restored to full flight status in May of that year. As a result, Deke Slayton put Shepard down to command Apollo 13. However, due to his inexperience, Apollo 13 would have only been Shepard's second spaceflight, and the inexperience of the other two crew members, Stuart Roosa and Edgar Mitchell, Slayton instead asked for the crews of Apollo 14 and Apollo 13 to switch. Shepard and the others would fly on Apollo 14, giving them extra time to train, while Jim Lovell and his team would fly Apollo 13. The two crews expected there to be little difference between the two missions, but we already know that Apollo 13 was a very, very different Apollo mission. LEM telescope. Assuming I wasn't just referring to the alignment optical telescope used for navigation, this would refer to the Apollo telescope mount on Skylab. Another part of the Apollo applications program, the telescope mount was built essentially out of leftover LEM hardware. It doesn't really look like it anymore, but when originally conceived, the plan was to build the telescope mount directly out of a LEM ascent stage. Grumman proposed that the telescope could be a free flyer, occasionally separating from the orbital workshop and going off to do observations on its own. It could be crewed or operated remotely from Skylab. Having it be free flying would increase stabilization periods and allow for higher pointing accuracy for stellar targets. In the end, the telescope mount we did get was the only other item to survive the demise of the Apollo applications program aside from Skylab itself. Apollo 14 LEM abort switch. Another one of those many small but almost very bad failures that show the difficulty and perseverance required to make the Apollo program a success. After Apollo 14 had reached lunar orbit and the LEM was separated, the astronauts were preparing to initiate their descent. The guidance computer suddenly received 4 back-to-back errant abort commands. Basically, the computer was being told to abort the mission, but nobody had told the computer to do that, and they didn't know why the command was being given. If they couldn't get it fixed and the abort command occurred during the descent would automatically be reversed and the landing wouldn't occur. Originally planning to simply deactivate the abort as soon as it was activated, a better solution was proposed and implemented by Don Iles, MIT programmer who had worked on the flight software. He devised a set of instructions for the astronauts to enter into the computer which would convince it that it was already in abort mode, but that the procedures for that abort had already happened. At this point, the computer would simply relax, believing it was at the end of an abort procedure that never happened. It worked. Apollo 14's landing was, of course, a complete success. Joseph Shea on Apollo 1. Shea was the manager of the Apollo Spacecraft Program Office in 1963 and was butting heads with a lot of people. He was very dissatisfied with NASA's relationship with North American aviation, whom he saw as undisciplined and ineffective. He was partly responsible for pushing the idea of all-up testing the Saturn V as one unit, rather than the incremental approach preferred by Wernher von Braun and others. His position of resolving differences within NASA and between NASA and its contractors naturally brought criticism to him, and this criticism, though he brushed it off, led to an eventual buildup of stress. And then Apollo 1 happened. Though not entirely happy with the changes and rate of updates to the spacecraft, it ended up passing its review. The crew, unhappy with this decision, presented Shea with this joke portrait, on the back of which was written, "It isn't that we don't trust you, Joe, but this time we've decided to go over your head." Shea landed at KSC less than 5 hours after the fire. He threw himself into the investigation, working 80-hour weeks, the stress taking its toll on him. Struggling with sleep, he ended up turning to barbiturates and alcohol to help himself cope, and eventually others began to notice his deteriorating mental state. He was asked to take a voluntary leave of absence, but he refused and threatened to resign instead. As a compromise, he agreed to see a psychiatrist, but Joe was a very witty man, and convinced the psychiatrist that he was fine, although he clearly wasn't. One of his friends described him as ready to kill himself at the height of all the tension. Realizing they needed a more direct approach, Shea was reassigned to NASA headquarters to serve as George Mueller's deputy in the Office of Manned Spaceflight. 6 months later, he left NASA, saying, quote, "I don't understand why, after everything I had done for the program, I was the only one that was removed. That's the end of the program for me." Shea ended up becoming the vice president of the Polaroid Corporation and was never called to testify before Congress regarding the Apollo 1 fire, which was the real reason for his reassignment in the first place. Cock rocket. Another Scott Manley contribution, this simply refers to the large amount of low-tech hand-built parts that went into the construction of the Saturn V, specifically how the command module's heat shield was constructed with cock guns. The shield's honeycomb structure contained 370,000 individual cells to be filled with resin, and in the 1960s, the only way to fill those cells properly was by hand, one cell at a time. The workers who filled the cells became known as gunners and were trained for 2 weeks before actually working on a capsule due to the delicate and critical nature of their work. MQF lost at fish hatchery. You've probably seen this photo of Nixon speaking to the Apollo 11 astronauts behind a barrier. They're inside the Mobile Quarantine Facility, or MQF, a modified Airstream trailer that the astronauts were housed in for a period of time after their return from the moon. Because these missions were so unprecedented, it was unknown if the astronauts might accidentally return some kind of bacteria or other contagion from the lunar surface, so they needed to be kept isolated and washed for any signs of contamination. There were 4 MQFs built, for Apollos 11, 12, 13, and 14, though the one for 13 wasn't actually used. After Apollo 14, it had been proven that the moon was sterile and the quarantine procedure was retired. 3 of the trailers are on display in museums, though the Apollo 13 one is currently MIA. It was used by the USDA for some time, but its current location is unknown, just like, for a long time, MQF-002 used for Apollo 12. MQF-002 went on a bit of a journey after its use in the Apollo program. It was first transferred to the CDC, where it was stored for years before being handed off to the U.S. Geological Survey. They then transferred the trailer to a fish hatchery that they ran in Marion, Pennsylvania. In 1998, the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources took control of the hatchery, and therefore the trailer. There it was repurposed several times. First, it was used for housing for graduate students doing research for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Later, it sat under a shed for over a decade, used only for storage. Oddly enough, the owners of the hatchery knew what it was, but NASA didn't know it was there. In fact, they had received a false report that it had been lost in a fire in Georgia, so they stopped looking for it. However, in 2007, the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, became aware of it and obtained the trailer, performed a complete restoration on it, and put it on display where it remains to this day. John Young learns about the space shuttle. As mentioned in the previous part, John Young was the pilot for STS-1, the very first space shuttle flight, alongside Robert Crippen in 1981. It was a landmark flight, as the space shuttle remains to this day the only crewed spacecraft to make its first orbital test flight with crew on board. There exists a curious overlap between space programs and a display of the amount of R&D time the shuttle underwent that occurs during Apollo 16. In 1972, 9 years before the shuttle flew its first flight, John Young and Charlie Duke were on the surface of the moon. Having just raised the flag, they were taking turns posing and saluting for photos. Mission Control interjected.
Good again. One for you. Okay, wait a minute, one more.
This looks like a good time for some good news here. The House passed a space budget yesterday, 277 to 60, which includes a vote for the shuttle.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Tony, again, I'll say it with that salute. I'm proud to be an American. I'll tell you, what a program, and what a place, and what an experience.
Yeah, and I'll say it too. So am I.
The country needs that shuttle mighty bad. You'll see.
It's interesting that while the Apollo program was coming to a close, the shuttle program was being granted funding, and the same man would be present for both of these historic events. John Young really did have a storied career. As an addendum, I'd like to show this photo taken at the launch site prior to Apollo 16's liftoff. While the second-to-last Apollo Saturn V sits on the launch pad in the distance, a mostly complete model of the space shuttle sits on a table. While the design of the orbiter itself clearly hasn't been finished, the arrangement of side-mounting the orbiter to an external fuel tank and 2 boosters had been finalized at this point, 9 years before the first shuttle would ever fly. Pete Conrad's hat. Hell yeah. Pete Conrad, Apollo 12, was a big fan of hats. All kinds of hats. He collected them, and he had the idea to bring one to the moon. It was designed by Uli Lotzman, who was actually a dental technician who had an amateur love of space travel and ended up working closely with the crew of Apollo 12, including design of the iconic, almost flown cap that, according to Conrad, must have never been approved for flight. Would have been pretty cool, though. Bezos raised an F1 engine. This is true. A man you may have heard of, Jeff Bezos, CEO of Amazon and Blue Origin, also runs something called Bezos Expeditions, something he uses for managing his personal investments. One of those investments involved finding and raising from the depths of the oceans the discarded remains of Saturn V first-stage engines used in the Apollo program. The team responsible for conservation of the recovered engines focused on preserving most of them as they were when they were found, though they did need to remove corrosion so that they would survive on display. After careful examination, it was revealed that one of the engine sets recovered had serial numbers tying them to the most important Apollo flight, Apollo 11. The others are from the following flight, Apollo 12. So, thanks Jeff, appreciate that. CEO, entrepreneur, born in 1960... Alright, I'm sorry. Michael Collins' Guinness record. Since Guinness World Records tend to be pretty silly, you might think it would be for loneliest man in the world. However, Al Warden gets that one because he was furthest away from the Earth at the height of his orbit around the far side of the moon. Collins' record is for the first spacewalk between spacecraft. On Gemini 10 in 1966, Collins exited the Gemini spacecraft with a tether and handheld zip gun and crossed the 3-meter gap between it and the Agena target vehicle. He retrieved a micrometeorite collector from the target vehicle before returning. I'll be honest, I don't know why this has to be a Guinness record, it's just a record. It's another first in space, another one of those achievements that the USA began to accrue in the second act of the space race. And that finishes off those double-decker cheeseburgers. One more to go. Big thanks to Zoe716 on Twitter, who contributed a large number of the lower tier items and provided information and material for several items as well. Zoe is a wealth of spaceflight knowledge, and I highly recommend following her on Twitter for obscure spaceflight knowledge that you didn't know that you needed, as well as subscribing to the Perigee Aerospace channel, which she co-runs. Grissom's Lemon. Starting off with a sad one. We all know Virgil Gus Grissom was a member of the ill-fated Apollo 1 crew, in addition to being the second American in space on Liberty Bell 7, and second American to fly in space twice, preceded only by Joe Walker in the X-15. Shortly before the Apollo 1 disaster, in perhaps the saddest moment of Grissom's storied career, he somewhat predicted what was going to happen. We talked in the first part of this iceberg about the crew's feelings of the Apollo 1 spacecraft. This Block 1 version of the CM had a lot of issues, and Grissom in particular was very vocal about his dissatisfaction with what he believed to be a faulty spacecraft. Furthermore, the simulator they were using was not being modified in time with the ever-changing spacecraft, making it difficult for them to accurately train with it. According to a book called Starfall by Grissom's wife Betty and Henry Still, Grissom made his last stop at his home near the Cape on January 22nd and went straight to the backyard. There, he went to their citrus tree and plucked a large lemon off of it. When asked what he was doing, he told his wife that, quote, "I'm going to hang it on that spacecraft," before leaving. He affixed the lemon to a wire coat hanger and hung the coat hanger above the Apollo spacecraft simulator's door. If you don't know, the symbolism here is that a lemon is a term used for a shoddy product. If you went to a used car lot and bought a bad car, you got a lemon. 5 days later, Gus Grissom perished in the plugs out test of January 27th, and his warnings were finally taken seriously. Roosa's Moon Trees. Something to bring up the mood. Stuart Roosa, Apollo 14, had spent time in the U.S. Forest Service as a smoke jumper. This is someone who jumps out of a plane into a wildfire with a parachute as a first responder, a badass job that I didn't know existed until today. Because of this experience, when he was placed on the crew of Apollo 14, he was contacted by an old friend, Ed Cliff, chief of the Forest Service. Cliff asked if Roosa would be interested in bringing seeds to space, and he was, carrying approximately 2,000 tree seeds in his personal kit as he orbited the moon in the CSM. Upon return to Earth, the seeds were germinated, which turned out to be a very difficult process due to some of the seed bags bursting open during decontamination. After a year in a somewhat inadequate facility, the remaining seeds were sent to the Forest Service in Mississippi and California, and since they weren't all individually tracked and cataloged, it's unknown how many exist today, but there are dozens of known moon trees across the United States, usually with some manner of label to let people know of their importance. Some were even planted alongside normal seeds to see if there was any difference, notably there hasn't been, and while Stuart Roosa may have passed away in 1994, the trees he helped plant with seeds from space are thriving to this day. LM variants and derivatives. Much like the Saturn V, there were a lot of ideas to modify or improve the Apollo lunar module for different purposes, largely for follow-on lunar missions that sadly would never occur. One variant did occur. All of the Apollo J missions used the extended LM, which made changes to allow for an increased payload capacity, bringing more scientific equipment, and staying on the surface for up to 3 days. There were many more ideas, and we've already discussed one, the free-floating telescope, but let's do a brief overview. A lot of these were meant to be used in conjunction with one another for extended lunar missions. For instance, one could be modified into a shelter that would be launched and landed without crew and would lack an ascent stage to allow for more life support equipment and could support astronauts for up to 14 days. These astronauts would arrive via a stripped-down LM taxi, which was used strictly for landing and ascent. At the same time, an LM truck could land with them, carrying more supplies for the extended duration missions. A larger shelter called the Lunar Base Module would strip even more systems away to allow for enlarged crew compartments and bulkheads. There were other free-flying Science LM ascent stage variants, such as the Lunar Reconnaissance Module that would lack an ascent engine but could rendezvous with the CSM periodically after doing observations of the moon. At the end of the day, the extended LM is the only idea ever to see the real world, but we may always wonder what could have been, if not for Tricky Dick. LES Uranium. LES stands for Launch Escape System, which would be the tower that sits on top of the command module at the tip of the Saturn V, designed to fire a small rocket motor and carry the capsule away from a failing rocket in the case of an emergency. It was never used in a live flight, but would you believe that thing contained uranium? Of course you would. If the LM had radioactive switch tips, why wouldn't the escape tower have depleted uranium in addition to lead used for weights in the ballast compartment of the nose cone to ensure stability during abort and jettison? It's depleted uranium, as I said, so not a big deal, but boy, a lot of strange parts made up the rocket that took humans to the moon. Apollo 14 docking failure. Guess how many attempts it took the Apollo 14 crew to do a successful transposition and docking? You'll never guess. It took a grand total of 6 attempts to finally lash the two crafts together.
Okay, Houston, we've hit it twice, and sure looks like we're closing fast enough. I'm going to back out here and try it again. Well, we better back off here and think about this one, Houston.
Roger.
We're unable to get a capture.
Why? Well, that took a lot of work to figure out. They never 100% confirmed what happened, but it seems the most likely explanation is that something got between the two ends of the mechanism. Some amount of leftover metal bits or tape or maybe even ice got caught in the middle and prevented the docking probe from fully latching. Thankfully, it had no effect on later docking attempts, and the mission went mostly smoothly from there. The joint landing proposal. It didn't necessarily have to be a race, you know. Well, honestly, it probably did. But there was a chance that sending humans to the moon could have been a cooperative effort. In 1963, at the United Nations General Assembly, President Kennedy offered to mount a joint lunar program with the USSR, suggesting that the two superpowers both had unique capabilities that could be used in conjunction, a suggestion that caught pretty much everyone very off guard. Quote, "In a field where the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capability, space, there is room for a new cooperation, for further joint efforts," he said. "I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the moon." Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev rejected the proposal, but in 1997, his son Sergei told a news outlet that his father had second thoughts. While frightened that the United States would gain intel on Soviet missile programs, he also believed the Soviets could absorb some of the valuable American technology as well, as if that was like the entire point. However, at the same time, this notion would have to go through Congress, and in the late 1960s would have been virtually impossible. It was the Cold War, after all. In the end, the proposal died with Kennedy some 2 months later, both nations absolving to push forward with their independent and competing programs. CSM terrain landing. As we all know, the Apollo command module would always land in the water to minimize the forces of that sudden stop under the aid of 3 parachutes. These parachutes slowed the capsule's descent to around 25 feet per second, which would not bode well if the capsule were somehow forced to land on hard terrain. However, as early as 1963, NASA was considering it as an emergency possibility just in case everything were to go horribly wrong. They performed numerous drop tests onto terrain and ended up refining the design to try and mitigate the force of a landing as much as they possibly could. The capsule descended through the air at an angle, and the leading edge that touched first was designed as a kind of crumple zone, absorbing some of the force of the impact. There were further improvements suggested by NASA contractors to create a pneumatic impact attenuation system specifically for terrain landings, but these were never put into practice. At the end of the day, the focus was put on making sure that the CM always hit the water, even waiting for launch conditions that would blow one out past the shore if an abort occurred early in the ascent. It was deemed overall that a terrain landing was very likely not survivable. The AGC source code. Sometime in, I'm gonna say 2016 because the 2019 article I found said, quote, "a few years ago," the source code for the Apollo guidance computer was released to the public over the internet. People began poring over it, using a simulator provided by the releaser called the Virtual AGC page, digging deep into the systems and how they worked. They uncovered a lot of interesting stuff, too much to go over here. For one thing, a file dedicated to engine ignition was titled Burn Baby Burn. Another dedicated to the keyboard and display system was titled Pinball Game Buttons and Lights. There was a treasure trove of comments left by the developers, which if you know anything about programming are sections of text that are made to be ignored by the actual program and exist only to inform other developers about how the code works. At the same time as the comments contain useful instructions, they also contain little jokes. A hello there, a goodbye come again soon, a Wizard of Oz reference, an entire paragraph from Shakespeare's Henry VI, and a lot more. It's a real rabbit hole, maybe worth coming back to one day. Or you can have a look at it yourself. It's free, it's public domain, and anyone can just download and look at the source code that took humans to the moon. What a time to be alive. Lunar Surface Rendezvous. When Apollo was being planned, there were 3 primary methods of performing a lunar landing that were taken into consideration. The first was direct descent, an extra powerful and extra complicated one-shot spacecraft that would be launched into orbit, land as one piece, then take off again as one piece before returning to Earth. The second, Earth Orbit Rendezvous, required building a moon-bound spacecraft in Earth orbit using several launches and dockings. This was effectively the early Soviet lunar program. The third was the chosen method, Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, referring to the LM ascent stage's return to lunar orbit to dock with the CSM. However, there was a fourth, often forgotten option, as it was kinda silly, but interesting, Lunar Surface Rendezvous. Here's how it would work. First, you launch a surveyor-derived uncrewed spacecraft to the moon. It's used as a survey and marking spacecraft. Next, you land a couple more spacecraft, a refueling tanker, a cargo vehicle, and finally, a one-way lander. When the astronauts arrive, they then go to the cargo vehicle and refueling tanker and build their way home. That's right, finish assembly of an ascent and return to Earth vehicle. In the end, obviously, this was deemed as too complicated and too expensive. Apollo 10 LM software. So we've got the AGC source code, but that software changed throughout the program, most notably between Apollos 10 and 11. Snoopy, the LEM for Apollo 10, was one of a kind, and its software only existed in one place, aboard it, currently orbiting around the Sun. So, what do? Well, obviously, you recreate it on your own from scratch. Or at least that's what software engineer Mike Stewart did. And this is no easy feat. Let me begin by pointing out that the AGC is written in assembly language. I took 2 years of computer programming in college, and I never touched or even heard of assembly language before I learned about the AGC. And don't say that's because these courses only teach modern languages, they don't. I learned COBOL, okay? How Stewart recreated the Apollo 10 code is very clever. He had access to an earlier version of the software, what he called almost but not quite the version that flew on Apollo 10. In addition, he also had access to the version of the software directly following Apollo 11. So, somewhere in the middle, the Apollo 10 code could be derived. He made a video describing the process of writing the code, a very slow and complicated process of checking and rechecking and cross-referencing with available data and then rechecking for a 5,000th time, but he finally did it. For the full story, watch this video in the top right corner. CM reuse/refurbishment. You might think this was an early idea of the Apollo program, and while it was certainly briefly considered in the early days, the idea of refurbishing and reusing an Apollo command module was actually an idea most talked about in the 1980s. With the Space Shuttle program just beginning, Rockwell PR began to float the idea of a reusable Apollo CM for use as a rescue ship on Space Station Freedom, which would eventually become the International Space Station. There were numerous problems with this, primarily that the Apollo CM was specifically designed to be intentionally damaged during re-entry and landing. This was part of that impact attenuation system we talked about, completely deforming its structure into its crumple zones. Furthermore, water landings presented the infiltration of contaminants that would slowly corrode the electronics, actuators, and seals. The RCS thrusters were built with a firing lifetime in mind, meaning that they would also need to be replaced. The final nail in the coffin is that capsule reuse isn't very cost efficient. Even if they're reused once, twice, or even 5 times, they will eventually need to be replaced, meaning that the ability to build new ones need to be retained, which is not a cheap process. While more modern capsules such as the SpaceX Dragon capsules can be reused, these too have a shelf life and significant refurbishment costs, if only because they land in salt water. Luna 15, the only time to my knowledge that 2 lunar missions were in progress at the same time. While Apollo 11 was finishing its spacewalk, Luna 15, an uncrewed Soviet probe, was beginning its descent to the lunar surface. This was the lunar program's second attempt to return lunar soil back to Earth, launched 3 days before Apollo 11 in, honestly, a feeble attempt to strip away some of the prowess of the first crewed lunar landing. However, it never quite got the chance. In the same spirit as more recent uncrewed attempts, Luna 15 crashed into the surface of the moon hours before Apollo 11 lifted off of the same surface. Transmissions ceased 4 minutes after it began its deorbit burn, with the general conclusion that it most likely crashed into the side of a lunar mountain. Many people see it as a symbolic representation of the conclusion of the space race. While the United States were setting foot on the moon, the Soviet Union was crashing into it. Wacky AAP concepts. This is the one item on this iceberg that I've realized shouldn't really be here. We've already discussed what the Apollo Applications Program was, a program to develop science-based human spaceflight missions using leftover Apollo hardware. In many ways, it was an era of NASA throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, but the burner is broken and only a few strands of spaghetti ended up being cooked. Most AAP concepts were unrealistic, dangerous, and had limited scientific returns, like some of the ones we've talked about, such as the Apollo Venus flyby. The reason it shouldn't be on the iceberg is because we've already discussed probably half a dozen AAP concepts already, and I would say most of them were pretty wacky. So for this item, I'll simply add another concept, the last proposal. Standing for lunar applications of a spent S-4B stage, the proposal was to modify the third stage of the Saturn V to be able to land on the moon. Why? What would it carry? What would you do with it? Well, the proposal never really got that far. The Douglas IBM team behind the proposal provided very few details. When asked, for instance, how astronauts in bulky spacesuits would climb the 60 feet to reach the top of the last vehicle, they offered only vague suggestions such as cargo and handling equipment. What kind of payloads would it carry? Also vague. There are a few sketches, such as this more elaborate version of a lunar rover, or this lunar flying unit for use by an astronaut. I'm not sure how I feel about this one, standing so close to engines that would be shooting sharp lunar regolith into the air around you. Don't know about that. Another option included creating a wet lab out of the spent stage, and we've discussed before the many difficulties and challenges of wet labs. Perhaps LAST might have offered more solutions to all of the challenges it presented, but unfortunately it would remain on paper to the end of time, like most of the AAP. The Apollo Spacecraft Feasibility Study. Conducted in 1960 to 1961, this is basically how the Apollo program's vehicles got their start. With the success of Project Mercury, NASA needed to plan a multi-crewed spacecraft that could be used for space stations and lunar missions. You see, at first, Apollo didn't have a specific goal. It simply stood for whatever came next in the world of crewed spaceflight. Once Kennedy committed the USA to a crewed lunar landing, the program was given focus, and many of the study designs were discarded in favor of working on the command module and designing the process of a lunar landing. Some of these designs were pretty out there, a lot like the AAP. Here's General Dynamics' proposal for a circumlunar mission, which makes absolutely no sense to me, but is better than Convair, who apparently selected a lifting body for return from the moon, which seems like a bad idea at those re-entry speeds. GE made a proposal that actually somewhat resembled the Soviet Soyuz, featuring a bullet-shaped descent module flanked by a conical mission module and a cylindrical propulsion module. They wouldn't be the only ones to eventually adopt this design. China's Shenzhou spacecraft and India's upcoming crewed orbital vehicle both use designs very similar to the three-piece tried-and-true Soyuz. In November of 1961, the study concluded when North American Aviation were awarded the Command and Service Module contract. At the time, it was assumed that the landing would be achieved by direct descent, meaning significant design changes were needed when Lunar Orbit Rendezvous was selected, not the least of which was a method to dock the CSM to another spacecraft. By 1963, the process was more or less sorted out, and Grumman had been contracted to construct the other half of the mission, the lunar module. Duke's family portrait. Our last entry of oddities and personal items left on the moon, Charlie Duke left a portrait of himself, his wife, and their 2 children on the moon. On the back of the photo was written, quote, "This is the family of astronaut Charlie Duke from planet Earth who landed on the moon on April 20th, 1972. Not much more to it than that. Just a nice family photo sitting in the lunar regolith waiting for an alien to pick it up and say, "Aw." At least we actually have photos of this one on the surface. It seems somewhat appropriate that the final item on the Apollo iceberg is "Are you a turtle?", given the thematic role turtles have played in my channel's history.
I like turtles.
This was the question posed to NASA Public Affairs Officer and Voice of Mission Control Paul Haney by Walt Cunningham, who was aboard the Apollo CSM on Apollo 7. He posed the question by holding up this cue card and another with Deke Slayton's name on it. Slayton, who wasn't present, recorded a response for Cunningham, which was the correct response. Paul Haney, however, did not answer the question, and as a result, was forced to buy several people a drink. You see, the question refers to the Ancient and Honorable Order of Turtles, a drinking club for American World War II pilots. According to the club's tradition, a member must answer this question by stating, "You bet your sweet ass I am." Haney, however, hadn't wanted to curse live over the radio, so as a result, he had to buy the other members present a drink. The cue card remained at Paul Haney's home until he passed away in 2009. Prior to his home, it had been in the Air and Space Museum, and while I can't find confirmation, it's possible that it's been returned there now. And there it is. The complete Apollo iceberg, explained, I hope, in sufficient detail. This has been a monumental undertaking. The first thing I need to say is that this is not actually complete. There is no complete Apollo iceberg, because there's simply too much information. While creating this, I opened it up to suggestions for about a week or two, eventually coming up with what I called version 0.9. However, after closing submissions, I received a mountain more of them, and then more, and then more, and then more. In fact, it never really stopped. Even after releasing parts 1 and 2, people were suggesting more additions, but there simply wasn't space. There had to be an upper limit somewhere, and so I chose where it was, after I jokingly released version 8.9.9.8.2.1 and ended up with the final product. But there truly is so much more to Project Apollo than it would seem. It is a vast ocean that has been lost to time, and if you go looking, you'll surely find things that were not covered here. By way of a for instance, I found that landable S4B proposal a couple days before writing these words. Thank you all so much for going on this journey with me. It was exhausting, stressful, and entirely worth it. It was one small step for Neil, but one giant leap into a world of space history obscurity for an unqualified nobody like me. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one.